Hey folks, tonight we're diving into some stories that'll make you question whether your subconscious mind might just be the best travel insurance you never knew you had. We're talking about travelers whose dreams warned them away from disasters so catastrophic that dodged a bullet doesn't even begin to cover it. These are people who literally dream their way out of death. So before you settle in for the night, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. But honestly, only if you actually enjoy falling asleep to bizarre historical stories. I'm not here to guilt trip you into engagement. And drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I genuinely love seeing our global community of insomniacs checking in from everywhere. Now, get comfortable, dim those lights. Maybe grab that favorite blanket that's probably overdue for a wash. And prepare to hear about dreams that function better than any GPS warning system ever invented. And don't feel bad if you drift off before we're done. That's honestly the whole point here. Though I have to warn you, some of these stories are so wild you might stay awake longer than you planned. You know what I find absolutely fascinating? That moment when you wake up from a really vivid dream and think, that felt way too real. Well, tonight we're talking about people who had that exact feeling, ignored it, then spent the rest of their lives grateful they changed their minds. Dreams don't just happen to you, sometimes they happen for you. Anyway, let's start with what might be the most famous case of a dream saving someone from the most infamous maritime disaster in history. So picture this, it's March 1912. And you're a wealthy businessman who's just booked first-class passage on the most luxurious, supposedly unsinkable ship ever built. You're probably feeling pretty smug about your travel arrangements. The Titanic was basically the private jet of its era, except floating and with more brass fixtures. But then J. Conan Middleton starts having the same nightmare every single night for 3 weeks straight. And I'm not talking about anxiety dreams where you show up to your cabin in your underwear. This was full-color, surround sound horror featuring the unsinkable ship floating upside down in freezing water while people screamed and died around him. Now you have to understand the context here. The White Star Line was literally advertising the Titanic as unsinkable. This wasn't modest marketing. They were claiming this ship was so technologically advanced that sinking was physically impossible. So having dreams about it going down was like having nightmares about your iPhone spontaneously combusting. Technically possible, but completely ridiculous to worry about. In Middleton's recurring nightmare, he saw the ship hit an iceberg late at night, which, by the way, was incredibly specific since most people assumed if anything happened to the Titanic, it would be a boiler explosion or fire, not an iceberg collision in the middle of nowhere. He dreamed about the exact sound the ship would make as it tilted forward and broke apart, a metallic groaning that he said was unlike anything he'd ever heard in real life. Here's what really gets me. Middleton saw lifeboats that were only half full rowing away from people drowning in the water. At the time, this seemed like the most unrealistic part of his dream. Why would lifeboats leave people behind? Why wouldn't they be completely packed? The logic made no sense until it happened exactly as he'd dreamed. But let me tell you more about what Middleton experienced in these nightmares, because the level of detail was absolutely insane. He wasn't just seeing generic ship sinking imagery, he was getting a documentary level preview of one of history's greatest maritime disasters, complete with technical specifications that he couldn't possibly have known. Let me paint you the full picture of what was happening to this man's sleep for 3 solid weeks. Imagine going to bed every night knowing, absolutely knowing, that you're about to watch over 1,500 people die in the most horrific maritime disaster in modern history. And not just watching it, but experiencing it with all 5 senses engaged. Feeling the cold Atlantic water on your skin, tasting the salt spray mixed with machine oil, hearing the exact pitch of metal tearing apart under unimaginable stress. In his dreams, Middleton found himself standing on the Titanic's deck around 11:40 p.m., watching other passengers enjoying their evening. Some were still in the smoking lounge playing cards and arguing about American politics. Others were taking romantic late-night strolls around the promenade deck, whispering sweet nothings while wrapped in expensive furs. The weather was calm, the sea was unusually smooth, and the night was so clear you could see stars reflecting on the water like scattered diamonds. Middleton could smell the mixture of coal smoke from the ship's 4 massive funnels, expensive cigars from the first-class smoking room, and that particular scent of well-oiled machinery that characterized the most advanced ocean liner ever built. He could hear the constant, reassuring throb of the ship's engines, a sound that passengers had grown to love because it represented safety, progress, and the triumph of human engineering over the raw power of the North Atlantic. Then, suddenly, Middleton would hear a sound that he described as like someone dragging a massive piece of sandpaper along the side of the ship. It wasn't a violent crash, it was almost gentle, which made it somehow more sinister. He would watch passengers pause in their conversations, looking around with mild curiosity rather than alarm, because the contact with the iceberg was so subtle that most people barely noticed it. One passenger, an elderly gentleman with a magnificent white mustache, actually commented to his companion, "Did you feel that slight tremor? Perhaps we've thrown a propeller blade." Another couple, newlyweds from Philadelphia, barely looked up from their romantic conversation. "Just a small wave, darling," the husband said, pulling his wife closer against the cool night air. But in his dream, Middleton could see what the passengers couldn't, the massive gash being torn in the ship's hull below the waterline. He somehow had X-ray vision into the ship's interior, watching freezing Atlantic water rushing into the forward compartments with the force of a tidal wave. The water wasn't just seeping in, it was exploding through the ruptured hull plates like liquid dynamite, flooding compartment after compartment with unstoppable mechanical precision. He could see the watertight bulkheads that were supposed to save the ship, those marvels of engineering that gave everyone such confidence in the Titanic's invincibility, and he watched with growing horror as the water level rose above them, one by one like stairs leading inevitably toward disaster. The ship could survive flooding in 4 compartments, maybe even 5 in perfect conditions. But 6 compartments? That was mathematically impossible. The Titanic was doomed from the moment the iceberg opened that 300-foot gash in her starboard side. What made Middleton's nightmare particularly disturbing was his ability to see the ship's crew, realizing the magnitude of the disaster in real time. He watched Captain Edward Smith receiving reports from the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, who was on board for the maiden voyage. In his dream, Middleton could hear their conversation with crystal clarity as Andrews explained the brutal mathematics of the situation. "Captain," Andrews said, his face pale but his voice steady, "she can survive flooding in the first 4 compartments. She was designed for that. But the impact has opened the first 6 compartments to the sea. The water will spill over the top of the bulkheads as she settles by the head. It's a mathematical certainty, sir. The ship will founder." Captain Smith, a man who had commanded ships for over 4 decades without losing a single passenger, stood silent for a long moment. In Middleton's dream, he could see the weight of realization settling on the captain's shoulders like a physical burden. "How long do we have?" Smith asked quietly. "An hour," Andrews replied. "Perhaps an hour and a half if we're fortunate. But, sir, we have over 2,200 souls aboard, and lifeboat capacity for barely half that number." Middleton also dreamed about the wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, frantically sending distress signals from the ship's Marconi room. He could hear Phillips tapping out CQD in Morse code, the traditional British distress call, and then switching to the newer international SOS signal when ships didn't respond quickly enough. The sound of that telegraph key became a frantic percussion in Middleton's nightmare, each tap representing another second of life slipping away for the 1,500 people who would die that night. He could see the wireless operators' growing desperation as they realized that the nearest ship, the Carpathia, was 58 miles away, too far to reach them before the Titanic went down. There was another ship much closer, the Californian, but her wireless operator had gone to bed for the night and wouldn't receive their desperate pleas for help. Phillips kept transmitting until the very end, even as the ship's electrical power began to fail and seawater started flooding the wireless room. In Middleton's dream, he could hear Phillips's final message. "Come as quickly as possible, old man. Our engine room is flooding." Then silence as 75,000, horsepower worth of generators went underwater and plunged the Titanic into darkness. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Middleton's prophetic dreams was his detailed vision of how the evacuation would unfold. He watched the crew struggling to launch lifeboats that hadn't been properly tested, saw passengers standing around in confusion because no one had conducted proper lifeboat drills. The crew themselves didn't know how to operate the new Welland Davits that were supposed to make launching boats easier and faster. He witnessed the terrible women and children first, protocol being implemented with tragic inefficiency, lifeboats being lowered half empty because crew members were afraid they would buckle under full weight. Even though they'd been tested to hold 65 people and were being launched with barely 30. Officer Charles Lytler was so concerned about the boats breaking that he was loading them far below capacity, then planning to have them pick up more passengers from the water. Except there wasn't time, and the water was so cold that people died within minutes of entering it. In his nightmares, Middleton could see specific individuals making life or death decisions with heartbreaking clarity. He watched John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men in the world, helping his pregnant young wife Madeline into lifeboat number 4. Astor asked if he could accompany her, given her condition, but Officer Lytler firmly refused. "No men are allowed in the boats until all the ladies are off," he said. Astor stepped back without argument, lit a cigarette, and went to die like a gentleman. His body was recovered weeks later, crushed beyond recognition. He saw Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet changing into evening dress in their stateroom, Guggenheim saying, "We've dressed our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." They spent their final hour helping women and children to the boats, then went down with the ship, their bodies never found. Middleton witnessed the ship's band, 8 professional musicians led by Wallace, Hartley continuing to play music to keep passengers calm, even as the deck tilted at increasingly impossible angles. They played ragtime numbers at first, trying to maintain a festive atmosphere, then switched to hymns as the reality of the situation became undeniable. Their final song was "Nearer, My God, to Thee," played as the ship's lights flickered and died around them. The most horrifying part of Middleton's dream was always the final 20 minutes, when the ship's lights finally went out and the Titanic broke apart with a sound he described as like the world's largest building collapsing in slow motion. The stress of the sinking had twisted the 882-foot hull beyond its breaking point, and the ship literally snapped in half just forward of the third funnel. He could see the ship's massive propellers rising out of the water as the stern section tilted almost vertical, people falling and sliding down the deck like rag dolls. Some passengers jumped from heights of over 100 feet, hoping to reach the relative safety of the water before the ship's suction pulled them down. Others clung desperately to railings and deck fixtures, fighting gravity itself in their final moments of life. Then came the part that haunted Middleton most, watching over 1,500 people, struggling in 28-degree water that would kill them within minutes. The human body simply cannot survive in water that cold. Even strong swimmers wearing life jackets died of hypothermia within 15 to 20 minutes. He could hear their screams echoing across the calm ocean, a sound that he said was unlike anything human voices should ever make, a collective cry of desperation from the dying that carried for miles across the still North Atlantic. And he watched the lifeboats, only half full, rowing away from the screaming instead of back to help them, because the survivors were afraid the drowning people would swamp their boats and drag everyone down with them. Only one boat, number 14 under 5th Officer Lowe's command, went back to look for survivors. They found only 3 people still alive among the hundreds of bodies floating in the debris field. Middleton was so disturbed by these recurring nightmares that he began keeping a detailed journal, documenting every aspect of his visions with the precision of a court reporter. He drew diagrams of the ship's layout, noting which areas would flood first and which escape routes would become blocked. He wrote down the names of crew members he'd never heard of but somehow knew would play crucial roles in the disaster. He sketched the faces of passengers he recognized from his dreams, people he'd never met but whose deaths he witnessed night after night. His wife, Helen, became increasingly concerned as she watched her husband's mental state deteriorate under the weight of these nightly visions. "James," she said one morning, finding him at his desk at 4 a.m., still writing frantically in his journal. You haven't slept properly in 2 weeks. These dreams, they're not real. They're just anxiety about the voyage. But Middleton looked up at her with haunted eyes and said, Helen, I've watched that ship sink 17 times now. I know exactly how many rivets will fail in the impact. I can tell you which lifeboat will be launched first and which one will be the last to leave the ship. I know the names of people I've never met, and I've seen them die. This isn't anxiety. This is something else entirely. He went to the White Star Line office on March 28th, exactly 2 weeks before the Titanic's scheduled departure, and tried to cancel his passage. The clerk, a young man named Timothy Harrison, was polite but firm. I'm sorry, Mr. Middleton, but your ticket is non-refundable. The sailing is fully booked, and we have a waiting list of over 300 people hoping for cancellations. Middleton tried to explain about his dreams, but Harrison's expression quickly changed from professional courtesy to barely concealed concern for the man's sanity. Sir, Harrison said carefully, perhaps you should speak with your physician about your concerns. The Titanic is the safest ship ever built. White Star Line guarantees it. When they refused to refund his substantial payment, and we're talking about serious money in 1912, equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars today, Middleton literally walked away from the loss rather than board that ship. His business partners at Middleton and Associates were furious about the important meetings he'd miss in New York. His planned merger with the American Textile Company was worth over $200,000, but Middleton couldn't bring himself to care about money when he was absolutely certain the voyage would kill him. James, you're destroying everything we've built, his partner Robert Caldwell told him. This is the opportunity of a lifetime, and you're throwing it away because of nightmares? What will people think? What will they say about the firm's stability if word gets out that you cancel the business trip because of dreams? But here's the thing about prophetic dreams: they don't care about your social obligations or your financial investments. Middleton said the dreams felt more real than his actual life, and he couldn't force himself to ignore that feeling. His wife later said that he would wake up screaming, soaked in sweat, sometimes still feeling the cold Atlantic water and hearing the screams of the drowning. She would find him standing at their bedroom window at 3 a.m., staring out at the London fog and whispering, "They're all going to die, Helen, all of them." The social pressure was enormous. In Edwardian society, a gentleman's word was his bond, and canceling important business commitments was seen as a sign of serious character defects. Middleton's reputation in London business circles began to suffer even before the Titanic sailed. People whispered that he was having a nervous breakdown, that the stress of expanding his business into American markets had finally gotten to him. His family physician, Dr. Edmund Hartwell, examined him thoroughly and found nothing wrong physically. "James," Dr. Hartwell said, "your body is perfectly healthy, but your mind is clearly under tremendous strain. I'm going to prescribe a mild sedative to help you sleep, and I strongly recommend you take a holiday somewhere quiet. Perhaps the countryside? These dreams you're having are clearly the result of overwork and anxiety about the voyage." But the sedatives made the dreams worse, more vivid and more detailed. Middleton stopped taking them after 3 nights, preferring insomnia to the enhanced horror of his nightly visions. He spent the 2 weeks before the Titanic's departure in a state of mounting dread, knowing exactly what was going to happen, but unable to convince anyone else to take his warning seriously. As we all know, the Titanic hit an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, and sank with the loss of over 1,500 lives. Every detail of Middleton's nightmare came true with documentary precision. The late-night collision, the way the ship broke apart, even the half-full lifeboats rowing away from the screaming. The man's subconscious mind had essentially provided him with a preview of one of history's greatest maritime disasters, complete with specific details that no one could have predicted. The wireless distress calls went out exactly as Middleton had dreamed. Captain Smith did give the order to prepare the lifeboats at 12:05 a.m. Thomas Andrews did make his grim calculations and informed the captain that the ship would sink. The band did play until the very end, and Benjamin Guggenheim did change into evening dress to die like a gentleman. When news of the disaster reached London 3 days later, Middleton felt no vindication, only profound grief and survivor's guilt. He had been right about everything, but his prophetic knowledge hadn't saved a single life except his own. He spent months in deep depression, wondering if there had been some way to use his visions to prevent the tragedy or at least warn more people about the danger. What I find absolutely fascinating is that Middleton wasn't the only one. At least 19 other people had documented prophetic dreams about the Titanic disaster. 19? That's not coincidence. That's some kind of cosmic early warning system that most people didn't know how to access. Mrs. Jack Marshall had nightmares about drowning in icy water while wearing her best evening dress, the one she'd packed specifically for the ship's elegant dinner parties. She was so terrified that on the morning they were supposed to leave for Southampton, she hid her husband's clothes and refused to tell him where they were until after the ship had sailed. Can you imagine that conversation? Honey, I've hidden your pants because I dreamed about drowning. But her irrational behavior saved both their lives? There was also a businessman named William Stead, who was actually on the ship and told dinner companions about prophetic dreams where he saw himself helping women and children into lifeboats before going down with the ship. Stead was known for his interest in spiritualism, so other passengers listened with interest rather than dismissing his dreams as anxiety. Tragically, his prophetic dream proved accurate. He did help others escape before dying in the disaster, exactly as he'd foreseen. You know what's really disturbing? Some passengers actually boarded the Titanic despite having prophetic dreams about the disaster. They had the warnings, they felt the dread, but social pressure and rational thinking convinced them to ignore their subconscious alarm systems. It makes you wonder how many disasters could be prevented if we just took our weirdest, most vivid dreams a little more seriously. Middleton lived until 1954, long enough to see the Titanic's wreck discovered and explored by underwater expeditions. He donated his dream journal to the Maritime Museum in Greenwich, where researchers studying the disaster were amazed by the accuracy of his pre-disaster descriptions. Every technical detail he had recorded, the location of the impact, the sequence of flooding, the behavior of passengers and crew, matched the historical record with impossible precision. Moving from ships to planes, let me tell you about Captain David Hobb, a commercial pilot who had been flying for 15 years without a single serious incident. Dave was known as Steady Dave among his colleagues, the kind of pilot who followed every safety protocol religiously and had an almost supernatural ability to sense potential aircraft problems before they became dangerous. But in October 1978, something changed in Dave's sleep patterns that would end up saving his life in the most unsettling way possible. Starting October 15th, Hobb began having the same nightmare every single night. And this wasn't some generic plane crash anxiety dream. He was dreaming about a specific aircraft, tail number N739PA, a Boeing 727 that he'd seen on the tarmac but had never actually flown. The level of detail in these dreams was absolutely ridiculous. He could see specific instrument readings, hear exact alarm sounds, and feel the aircraft's response to control inputs with technical accuracy that seemed impossible for a sleeping mind to generate. In the nightmare, everything would start normally, routine, pre-flight, checklist, normal taxi to the runway, clearance for takeoff. But at the moment of rotation, when the wheels lifted off the tarmac, something would go catastrophically wrong. Dave described hearing like someone ripping apart the world's largest piece of fabric, a tearing, grinding noise from deep within the aircraft's structure. Now let me take you deep into the psychological and technical hell that Dave was experiencing every single night for weeks. Because this wasn't just a scary dream, this was like being forced to live through the same aviation disaster repeatedly, with his professional knowledge making every detail more terrifying than it would be for a civilian. Picture Dave Hobb at 3 a.m., jolting awake in his modest ranch house in Burbank, California, his pilot's pajamas soaked with sweat, his heart hammering so hard against his ribs that he could hear it echoing in his ears. His wife, Jane, would wake up beside him, finding Dave sitting on the edge of their bed, his head in his hands, trying to separate dream from reality while his nervous system was still convinced he had just survived a plane crash. The same dream again? Jane would ask, her voice thick with sleep and growing concern. She'd been married to Dave for 12 years, through his entire commercial aviation career, and she'd never seen him like this. Dave was the kind of man who could land a 727 in a crosswind that would terrify other pilots, who could troubleshoot mechanical problems that left maintenance crews scratching their heads. But these dreams were breaking him down night after night. "It's not just a dream, Jane," Dave would whisper, his voice hoarse from sleep and terror. "I can feel every vibration in that cockpit. I know exactly which warning light comes on first, exactly what the engine sounds like when it starts to disintegrate. I've never flown N739PA, but I know that plane better than any aircraft I've actually piloted." The technical details in Dave's dreams were impossibly specific. He would find himself in the left seat of the Boeing 727, going through his standard pre-flight routine with the methodical precision that had kept him alive for 15 years of commercial flying. He could feel the familiar weight of his flight bag beside his seat, could smell the distinctive mixture of hydraulic fluid, electrical components, and the particular scent that every aircraft has, a combination of metal, rubber, and the lingering traces of thousands of previous flights. Dave's dream would always begin at San Diego International Airport, which was odd because he rarely flew routes that originated there. He could see the specific gate number, Gate 19, and the exact time displayed on the cockpit. Chronometer, 7:25 a.m. The weather was clear, winds light and variable. Perfect flying conditions that should have made for a routine departure. He would conduct his pre-flight inspection with his usual thoroughness, checking fuel quantities, oil levels, hydraulic pressures, all the vital signs that determined whether 144 people would live or die based on his professional competence. Everything looked normal. The maintenance logbook showed no outstanding discrepancies. The aircraft had been inspected just 3 days earlier and passed all required checks. But as Dave performed his external walk-around inspection in the dream, he would notice subtle things that bothered him without being able to articulate why. There was a tiny stain on the tarmac beneath the number 2 engine, just a few drops of what looked like oil or hydraulic fluid. The left main landing gear tire had a slight scuff mark that suggested recent hard braking. The fuselage skin around the engine mounts looked slightly discolored, as if subjected to excessive heat at some point. These were the kind of minor discrepancies that experienced pilots notice, but that maintenance crews often dismiss as normal wear and tear. In his dream, Dave would make notes about these observations, but the maintenance supervisor would wave off his concerns. "Captain Hobb, that aircraft is airworthy. We've got a schedule to maintain, and you're holding up departure?" The passengers boarding Flight 182 were individuals Dave could see with photographic clarity, even though he'd never met any of them in real life. There was Mrs. Patricia Robertson, a 47-year-old schoolteacher from Los Angeles, visiting her sister in San Diego. She always chose an aisle seat in row 12 because she was claustrophobic. There was young Tommy Chun, an 8-year-old boy traveling alone to visit his grandparents, clutching a stuffed elephant named Mr. Peanuts that his mother had given him for the flight. Dave could see James Morrison, a businessman in his 50s who was nervous about flying and always ordered 2 drinks before takeoff to calm his nerves. There was Maria Santos, a flight attendant deadheading back to Los Angeles after her shift, sitting in the last row and reading a romance novel. Each passenger had a story, a life, people who loved them and were waiting for their safe arrival. The most disturbing aspect of Dave's prophetic dreams was his ability to experience the disaster from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Sometimes he was in the cockpit, fighting desperately to control an aircraft that was destroying itself from the inside out. Other times he seemed to be floating in the passenger cabin, watching people's faces change from boredom to confusion to absolute terror as they realized something was seriously wrong. He could hear flight attendant Susan Martinez making her standard safety announcement, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182 with service to Los Angeles. We'll be cruising at an altitude of 31,000 feet. Her voice was calm and professional, but in Dave's dream he knew she had less than 8 minutes to live. The takeoff roll would proceed normally. with Dave advancing the throttles and feeling the familiar surge of acceleration as 75,000 pounds of aircraft and fuel gathered speed. Down runway 27, the engines sounded healthy, all three of them producing their rated thrust with the steady roar that passengers associated with safety and reliability. At 143 knots indicated airspeed, Dave would pull back on the yoke, rotating the aircraft into its climb attitude. And that's when the nightmare would truly begin. At exactly 147 knots, just as the main landing gear lifted off the runway, Dave would hear that sound like someone ripping apart the world's largest piece of fabric. It wasn't an explosion or a bang. It was a deep, tearing noise that seemed to come from the very soul of the aircraft. The sound of metal components that had been stressed beyond their design limits finally surrendering to forces they could no longer contain. The number 2 engine, mounted at the rear of the fuselage, would begin its death throes. Dave could see the engine pressure ratio gauge for that engine starting to fluctuate wildly, indicating that the compressor blades were starting to disintegrate inside the engine casing. The exhaust gas temperature would spike to levels that should have been impossible, while the N1 and N2 rotor speed indicators would show the engine literally tearing itself apart. But this wasn't just a simple engine failure, the kind of emergency that commercial pilots train for regularly and can usually handle without loss of life. This was a catastrophic uncontained engine failure, where the disintegrating engine would send high-velocity shrapnel through the aircraft's structure, severing control cables, hydraulic lines, and electrical systems that were never designed to survive such an assault. Dave would feel the aircraft immediately start to yaw and roll to the right as the asymmetric thrust from the 2 remaining engines overcame his control inputs. He would push hard on the left rudder pedal, trying to keep the nose pointed straight ahead, but the rudder cables had been severed by engine debris. The primary flight controls were becoming increasingly unresponsive. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Dave would transmit on the emergency frequency, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. PSA 182, we have an uncontained engine failure, number 2 engine. We're declaring an emergency and requesting immediate vectors back to San Diego. But even as he spoke those words, Dave knew in his heart that they weren't going to make it back to any airport. The aircraft was losing altitude and airspeed, and he could feel through the flight controls that they were rapidly running out of options. The backup hydraulic systems were failing one by one as engine debris continued to cause damage throughout the aircraft's structure. First Officer Robert Fox, Dave's co-pilot in the Dream, would be working frantically through the emergency checklists, trying to isolate the failed systems and restore some degree of control. Engine fire lights, engine 2, Fox would call out. Engine fire handle pulled, bottle discharged. No effect on the firelight. The flight engineer, Patricia Williams, would be calling out system failures as fast as she could read the warning lights. Hydraulic system A failure. Hydraulic system B showing low pressure, electrical system 2 offline, cabin pressure dropping rapidly. But Dave could see that their efforts were futile. The damage was too extensive, the aircraft too compromised to survive. They had perhaps 90 seconds before impact, and there were no good options left. They were too low and too slow to reach any suitable landing area, and the aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control as more systems failed. In the passenger cabin, people were beginning to realize that something was seriously wrong. The steep banking and altitude changes weren't part of normal flight operations. Oxygen masks had dropped from the overhead compartments as the cabin pressure dropped, giving the cabin an otherworldly appearance as people struggled to understand what was happening. Dave could hear Susan Martinez on the cabin address system, her training taken over even in the face of certain death. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened and follow the instructions of your flight attendants. But Dave could also see the fear in her eyes, could hear the slight tremor in her voice that betrayed her knowledge that this wasn't just technical difficulties. She knew, just as he knew, that they were all going to die in the next few minutes. Young Tommy Chun was crying for his mother, clutching Mr. Peanut so tightly that his knuckles were white. Mrs. Robertson was praying quietly, her lips moving in silent supplication to a God she hoped was listening. James Morrison had stopped drinking and was sitting perfectly still, staring out the window at the ground that was rushing up to meet them with inexorable finality. Dave would spend his final moments trying everything he could think of to save the aircraft and its passengers. He would experiment with different power settings on the two remaining engines, trying to find some combination that would give them controllable flight. He would attempt to use the trim tabs to compensate for the severed flight controls. He would even consider trying to belly land the aircraft in the open fields he could see through the cockpit windows. But physics is unforgiving, and mathematics doesn't care about human hopes and dreams. The aircraft had been too severely damaged to sustain flight, and gravity was claiming its inevitable victory. At 7:33 a.m., exactly 8 minutes after takeoff, PSA Flight 182 would impact a residential neighborhood in North Park, San Diego, killing all 144 people on board plus 7 people on the ground. Dave would experience his own death in the dream with horrible clarity. He would feel the G-forces of impact, would see the cockpit crumpling around him, would taste the metallic flavor of blood in his mouth as his body was crushed by forces that human anatomy was never designed to survive. And then darkness, silence, and the knowledge that 143 other people had died because he hadn't been able to save them. Then Dave would wake up, gasping and shaking, his nervous system convinced that he had just died in a plane crash. The transition from the vivid reality of the dream to the quiet safety of his bedroom was jarring and disorienting. For several minutes, he would lie in bed, his heart pounding, trying to convince himself that he was alive, that it had only been a nightmare. But the technical details were too specific, too accurate for a normal anxiety dream. Dave had never flown a 727 out of San Diego. He had never experienced an uncontained engine failure. He had never seen the specific faces of the passengers who populated his nightmares. Yet somehow his sleeping mind was generating information about aircraft systems, emergency procedures, and human behavior under extreme stress that felt more real than his waking memories of actual flights. After the third consecutive night of the same nightmare, Dave made the decision that would save his life. He went to his supervisor, Captain William Morrison, and requested that he not be assigned to fly aircraft N739PA. The conversation took place in Morrison's small office at Los Angeles International Airport, surrounded by flight manuals, weather charts, and the bureaucratic detritus of commercial aviation. "Dave," Morrison said, leaning back in his chair and studying his senior pilot with concern, "you've been flying for 15 years without any problems. Your safety record is impeccable, your passenger evaluations are outstanding, and you're one of our most reliable captains. What's going on?" Dave tried to explain about the dreams without sounding like he was having a complete mental breakdown. "Bill, I've been having these nightmares about a specific aircraft, N739PA. They're not normal dreams. They're incredibly detailed, technically accurate visions of a catastrophic engine failure during takeoff. I can see exactly how it happens, exactly which systems fail, exactly how many people die. I can't explain it, but I know that aircraft is going to crash." Morrison's expression shifted from concern to barely concealed alarm. In 1978, the airline industry was still largely a boys' club where showing weakness or uncertainty could end a career. Psychological fitness was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized. Pilots who reported mental health issues often found themselves grounded permanently, their medical certificates revoked by Federal Aviation Administration doctors who erred on the side of extreme caution. "Dave," Morrison said carefully, "I think you need to talk to someone about these dreams. Dr. Henderson in our medical department can recommend a good psychiatrist. This sounds like you're under a lot of stress, maybe working too many hours, but I can't just reassign aircraft based on nightmares. What would the other pilots think? What would the company think?" Dave tried to press his case, describing the technical details of his dreams, the specific nature of the engine failure, the exact sequence of events that would lead to the crash. But to Morrison, this level of detail made Dave's mental state seem even more concerning. Normal people didn't have dreams with such technical precision. Normal people didn't obsess over specific aircraft tail numbers. The conversation ended with Morrison suggesting that Dave take some time off, maybe see a doctor, and certainly stopped talking about prophetic dreams before word got around the pilot community that he was having psychological problems. "Dave, I'm saying this as a friend," Morrison concluded. "Keep these dreams to yourself. The company doesn't need to hear about this, and neither do your fellow pilots. Get some help, get some rest, and we'll reassign your flights for the next few weeks while you sort this out." But Dave's nightmares didn't stop. If anything, they became more vivid and more detailed as November approached. He began keeping a detailed journal, documenting every aspect of his dreams with the precision of an accident investigator. He drew diagrams of the cockpit layout, noting which warning lights would illuminate and in what sequence. He wrote down the names and descriptions of passengers he saw in his dreams, even though he had no way of knowing if these people actually existed. Jane became increasingly worried as she watched her husband's mental state deteriorate under the weight of these nightly visions. "Dave, you're scaring me," she told him one morning after finding him at the kitchen table at 4 a.m., still writing in his dream journal. "You haven't slept properly in weeks. These dreams are consuming your life. Maybe Bill Morrison is right. Maybe you should see someone." But Dave was convinced that his dreams weren't symptoms of mental illness. They were warnings. "Jane, I've been flying for 15 years. I know the difference between anxiety dreams and something else. These aren't random nightmares. They're showing me a specific disaster involving a specific aircraft. I don't know why, and I don't know how, but I know that plane is going to crash." Dave's solution was to make sure he never flew N739PA, even if it meant violating company policies and potentially damaging his career. He began trading shifts with other pilots, calling in favors built up over 15 years of professional relationships, and finding creative ways to avoid being assigned to that particular aircraft. His colleagues began to notice his unusual scheduling requests, but Dave deflected their questions with vague references to personal preferences and maintenance concerns. The isolation was brutal. Dave couldn't discuss the technical details of his nightmares with Jane because she lacked the aviation knowledge to understand what he was describing. He couldn't talk to his fellow pilots without seeming unstable or superstitious. He couldn't approach his supervisors without risking his career and his medical certificate. He was trapped in a situation where he had specific knowledge about a future disaster, but no socially acceptable way to act on that information. On November 25, 1978, PSA Flight 182 operating aircraft N739PA crashed during takeoff from San Diego International Airport, exactly as Dave had been dreaming for weeks. The Boeing 727 experienced an uncontained failure of its number 2 engine at 147 knots during takeoff roll, sending high-velocity debris through the aircraft's structure and severing critical flight controls. The crew fought heroically to save the aircraft, but the damage was too extensive. All 144 people on board died when the plane crashed into a residential neighborhood in North Park, the National Transportation Safety Board. Investigation revealed that the engine failure had been caused by a manufacturing defect in one of the compressor stages, a microscopic crack that had been growing for months, until it finally reached critical size. The defect was undetectable through normal maintenance inspections and had been missed by multiple routine checks. Every detail of Dave's nightmares proved to be accurate with documentary precision. The sequence of system failures, the crew's response to the emergency, even the specific location of the crash matched his dreams exactly. The passenger manifest included individuals whose faces and names Dave had seen in his sleep: Mrs. Patricia Robertson, Tommy Chun, James Morrison, Maria Santos. They had all died exactly as he had witnessed in his prophetic visions. When Dave heard about the crash, he felt no vindication or relief that his premonitions had been correct. Instead, he was overwhelmed by a crushing combination of survivors' guilt and profound grief for people he had never met but whose deaths he had experienced repeatedly in his dreams. He spent hours reading newspaper accounts of the disaster, studying photographs of the wreckage, trying to understand how his sleeping mind had been able to access such detailed information about a future event. Dave never returned to commercial flying. The psychological trauma of having accurate prophetic dreams about a mass casualty event was too much for him to process while maintaining the emotional stability required for safe flight operations. He took early retirement from the airline and spent the rest of his career as a flight instructor at a small airport in Arizona, teaching student pilots the basics of aviation while trying to understand what had happened to him during those terrible weeks in October and November 1978. His story became part of unofficial aviation folklore, whispered among pilots who had heard rumors about the captain who had somehow known about PSA Flight 182 before it happened. But Dave never spoke publicly about his experience, knowing that admitting to prophetic dreams would damage his credibility and potentially affect the careers of pilots who might have similar experiences in the future. The really unsettling question that Dave's story raises is how many disasters might be prevented if we had better systems for recognizing and acting on these kinds of warnings. His dreams were incredibly specific and completely accurate, but the social and professional structures of commercial aviation made it impossible for him to use that information to save lives. The very specificity that made his dreams prophetic also made them seem like evidence of mental instability to people who hadn't experienced them. Dave's experience suggests that our unconscious minds might be capable of detecting patterns and predicting outcomes in ways that our conscious awareness can't match. Maybe his brain was processing subtle environmental cues, variations in engine sounds, changes in maintenance patterns, statistical anomalies in aircraft performance data, and integrating this information into predictive models that appeared in his dreams as fully realized disaster scenarios. Or maybe human consciousness occasionally gains access to information about future events through mechanisms that science doesn't yet understand. Either way, Dave Hobbs' prophetic dreams about PSA Flight 182 remain one of the most documented and technically accurate cases of aviation-related precognition in modern history, raising profound questions about the nature of time, consciousness, and the hidden capabilities of the human mind. In 1889, a traveling salesman named Frederick Walsh was supposed to take the 11:17 p.m. express train from London to Edinburgh. Fred had made this journey dozens of times. It was part of his regular sales route, and he knew the schedule, the stops, and even which car had the most comfortable seats by heart. But 3 days before his scheduled departure, Fred started having dreams that were so vivid and disturbing that his wife later said they changed his personality completely. He went from being a cheerful, optimistic guy who loved traveling and meeting new people to someone who seemed haunted by something he couldn't explain. In Fred's recurring nightmare, he was sitting in his usual spot on the Edinburgh Express, third car from the engine, window seat on the right side where he could watch the countryside roll by while he organized his sales notes. Everything would start normally. The train would pull out of the station right on schedule, picking up speed as it left London's outskirts and headed north through the rolling hills. But somewhere around the 2-hour mark of the journey, Fred would hear a sound that he described as like the earth itself screaming. The train would suddenly lurch violently to one side, then begin a nightmarish tumbling motion as the cars derailed and rolled down an embankment. In his dream, Fred could feel every impact, every rolling motion, every piece of metal and wood that would crush the passengers around him. What made Fred's nightmare particularly disturbing was its incredible attention to detail. He could see specific passengers being thrown around the car, hear the exact sounds of metal twisting and glass shattering, and feel the train cars stacking up on top of each other in a pile of wreckage. He knew exactly which passengers would die instantly and which would survive long enough to call for help that wouldn't come in time. Now, let me paint you a picture of what Fred was going through during these 3 nights of hell. This wasn't just your garden variety anxiety dream about missing a connection or losing your luggage. Fred was experiencing full sensory disasters that felt more real than his actual waking life. The sounds alone were enough to drive a person mad. Fred described hearing the initial impact, that moment when the locomotive's wheels first left the rails, as a grinding, screeching symphony of metal against metal that seemed to go on forever. Then came the secondary sounds, the splintering of wooden car frames, the explosive shattering of windows, the dull thuds of heavy objects, including people being thrown around the interior of the cars. But it was the human sounds that really tormented Fred. He could hear specific voices crying out in terror and pain. There was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow who always traveled in the second car and knitted during the journey. Fred could hear her calling for her deceased husband as the car rolled down the embankment. There was young Thomas Mitchell, a university student who was returning to Edinburgh after visiting his parents in London. Fred heard him screaming for his mother as debris crushed his legs. The most disturbing aspect of Fred's dreams was his ability to experience the disaster from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Sometimes he was trapped in his seat, feeling the car roll over and over while luggage and other passengers crashed around him. Other times he seemed to be floating above the wreckage, watching the entire disaster unfold like some kind of cosmic observer documenting a tragedy for posterity. Fred told his wife about these dreams, and you can imagine how that conversation went. Picture a Victorian household where men were expected to be stoic and rational, and here's Fred describing nightmares so vivid that he's waking up in cold sweats, sometimes still feeling phantom pain from injuries he'd sustained in his dreams. His wife, Margaret, was initially sympathetic but increasingly concerned as the dreams continued night after night with the same horrible consistency. "Perhaps you should see Dr. Morrison," she suggested after the third night. "Maybe he could prescribe something to help you sleep more peacefully." But Fred knew this wasn't about insomnia or stress-related nightmares. These dreams had a quality of inevitability, of absolute certainty, that separated them from normal anxiety. He felt like he was receiving advanced intelligence about a future disaster, transmitted through some channel that science couldn't explain. The psychological torture of these dreams was compounded by Fred's sense of helplessness. In his nightmares, he would sometimes try to warn other passengers about the impending derailment, but they couldn't hear him or see him. He was like a ghost, haunting his own future tragedy, able to witness but unable to prevent. Fred had built his career on reading people and situations accurately. That's what made him a successful salesman. He could sense when a potential client was genuinely interested versus just being polite, could tell when business relationships were solid versus when they were about to fall apart. But these dreams were operating on a completely different level of perception, showing him events that hadn't happened yet with documentary precision. The night before his scheduled departure, Fred had the nightmare again, but this time it was even more specific. He saw the exact location where the derailment would occur, a curved section of track that ran along a steep embankment near a small village called Armagh. He could see the village church steeple in the distance, a distinctive bridge over a stream, and even specific trees that would be damaged when the train cars rolled down the hillside. In this final dream, Fred also saw something that chilled him to the bone, his own death. He watched himself being crushed under a beam from the car's roof. His sales case scattered around him, his carefully organized route plans fluttering away in the wind like autumn leaves. The image was so vivid that when he woke up, Fred actually checked his body for injuries, half convinced that he had somehow died and come back to life. When Fred woke up that morning, he made a decision that his rational mind couldn't justify, but that his gut absolutely demanded. He went to the station and told the ticket agent that he was too ill to travel. Instead of the valuable Edinburgh trip that he needed to pay his bills and support his family, he spent the day in bed telling his wife he had a terrible headache and couldn't shake a feeling of impending doom. Margaret was torn between relief that Fred wouldn't be traveling in his disturbed state and concern about the financial implications of missing such an important business trip. The Edinburgh route was one of Fred's most profitable, and canceling at the last minute meant disappointing several major clients who were expecting his visit. But Fred's conviction was absolute. He told Margaret, "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. If I get on that train tonight, I will die, and so will many other innocent people. I can see it as clearly as I can see your face right now." The 11:17 p.m. London to Edinburgh Express derailed exactly as Fred had dreamed, at the precise location he'd seen in his nightmare at approximately the time he'd experienced in his sleep. The derailment was caused by a broken rail that had gone undetected during routine maintenance inspections. The train cars rolled down the embankment and stacked up exactly as Fred had envisioned, killing 73 passengers and injuring over 200 others. The most chilling detail? When investigators examined the wreckage, They found that the third car from the engine Fred's usual spot had been completely crushed by the cars that rolled on top of it. Every passenger in that section died instantly. Fred's prophetic nightmare hadn't just shown him a general disaster. It had specifically warned him away from the exact location where he would have died. The local newspapers covered the Armagh derailment extensively, and Fred read every account with a mixture of grief and bewilderment. The descriptions of the crash scene matched his dreams with impossible accuracy. The way the cars had stacked up, the specific trees that were damaged, even the time of night when the disaster occurred. One newspaper account described finding Fred's regular seat, third car, right side window, completely destroyed under tons of twisted metal and splintered wood. The passenger who had taken that seat, a young clerk named William Thompson, was identified by his pocket watch, which had stopped at exactly 1:23 a.m., the precise time Fred had seen in his final nightmare. The psychological impact of having his prophetic dreams proven accurate was almost as traumatic as experiencing the crash itself would have been. Fred spent weeks in a state of confused guilt, wondering if he could have somehow prevented the tragedy by warning the railway authorities about his visions. But how do you convince Victorian-era officials to cancel a train service? Because a traveling salesman has been having nightmares? Margaret later described how the experience changed Fred permanently. He never slept peacefully again, she wrote in her diary. Even when he wasn't having prophetic dreams, he would wake up startled, as if expecting to hear the sound of derailing trains. The confidence he'd always had in his ability to predict and control his business environment was shattered. Fred continued working as a traveling salesman for another 15 years, but he never again took overnight train journeys. He switched to day travel exclusively and always chose different cars and different seats, as if his close call with prophetic death had taught him not to be too predictable in his travel patterns. He said the experience made him realize that sometimes our strangest dreams might be the most important ones to pay attention to. The Armagh derailment became a landmark case in British railway safety, leading to new regulations about track maintenance and train scheduling. But Fred's story remained a family secret, shared only with close relatives who struggled to understand how their practical, rational patriarch had somehow dreamed his way out of one of the deadliest train crashes in British history. In his later years, Fred would sometimes tell his grandchildren about the importance of listening to their dreams, especially the ones that seemed too vivid or too specific to dismiss as mere fantasy. "Your sleeping mind knows things your waking mind hasn't figured out yet," he would say. Sometimes the only difference between life and death is whether you're brave enough to trust what your dreams are trying to tell you. Fred's case illustrates something fascinating about prophetic dreams related to transportation disasters. Unlike dreams about personal relationships or business decisions, these visions often include incredibly specific technical details, exact locations, precise timing, even mechanical causes of accidents. It's as if the sleeping mind can access information about physical systems and their failure points in ways that normal consciousness can't match. Modern researchers studying precognitive experiences have found that transportation-related prophetic dreams are among the most accurate and detailed categories of future-seeing visions. Some theorists suggest that our brains might be constantly processing subtle environmental cues, vibrations from weakening infrastructure, sounds from mechanical systems under stress, even electromagnetic fields from failing electrical systems, and integrating this information into predictive models that appear in dreams. From this perspective, Fred's nightmares might not have been supernatural visions of the future, but rather his unconscious mind's sophisticated analysis of railway system vulnerabilities that his conscious awareness couldn't detect. His brain might have been processing tiny variations in train sounds, track conditions, and maintenance patterns that indicated increasing probability of mechanical failure. Either way, Fred's story stands as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most irrational-seeming decisions can be the most life-saving ones. His willingness to trust his prophetic dreams over social expectations and financial pressures literally saved his life and left him with a profound appreciation for the mysterious capabilities of human consciousness. Maritime disasters seem to generate an unusual number of prophetic dreams. And here's another case that's absolutely fascinating in its specificity. In 1904, a well-to-do widow named Eleanor Patterson had booked passage on the steamship General Slocum for what was supposed to be a pleasant excursion up the East River in New York City. Eleanor was a regular passenger on these river excursions. She enjoyed the fresh air, the views of Manhattan from the water, and the social atmosphere of the boat trips. The General Slocum was a popular choice for church groups, family outings, and social clubs looking for an elegant way to spend an afternoon on the water. It was considered one of the safest, most reliable passenger vessels operating in New York Harbor. But starting a week before her scheduled trip, Eleanor began having dreams that transformed her anticipated pleasant afternoon into a vision of absolute horror. In her nightmare, she was standing on the deck of the General Slocum, enjoying the river breeze and watching other passengers chatting and laughing around her. Everything seemed normal and cheerful. Families with children, elderly couples, young people enjoying a social outing. Then suddenly, Eleanor would smell something that filled her with instant terror: smoke. Not the pleasant smell of tobacco or cooking, but the acrid, chemical smell of something burning that shouldn't be. In her dream, she would see flames erupting from the lower decks of the ship, spreading with impossible speed through the wooden structure. The most terrifying part of Eleanor's nightmare was watching how quickly the pleasant excursion transformed into complete chaos. Passengers who had been laughing and socializing moments before were suddenly running in panic, looking for ways to escape from a ship that was rapidly becoming a floating inferno. She could see specific people she recognized from previous trips: the elderly man who always brought breadcrumbs for the seagulls, the young mother with twin daughters who liked to stand at the bow and watch the water, all of them trapped on a burning ship with nowhere to go. Now, let me give you the full horror of what Eleanor was experiencing in these dreams, because the psychological torture was almost unbearable. Picture waking up every morning for a week straight, not from gentle sunlight filtering through your bedroom curtains, but from the sensation of smoke filling your lungs and the sounds of people screaming in terror. Eleanor's dreams weren't just visual. They were completely immersive experiences that engaged all her senses with devastating realism. She could feel the heat of the flames against her skin, even from a distance. She could taste the acrid smoke that made breathing difficult and painful. She could hear not just the general chaos of a disaster, but specific voices calling for help, children crying for their parents, and the terrible crackling sound of wood being consumed by fire. In her nightmare, Eleanor watched passengers jumping into the East River to escape the flames, only to discover that many of them couldn't swim well enough to reach shore. The river that had seemed so pleasant and peaceful during normal excursions became a death trap as people who had escaped the fire drowned in the water. She could hear their screams echoing across the water while the burning ship continued to drift, downstream like a floating hell. What made Eleanor's dream particularly disturbing was her ability to see the specific cause of the disaster. In her nightmare, she watched a small fire start in a storage area filled with cleaning supplies and quickly spread to the ship's wooden structure, which had been painted with highly flammable materials. She saw exactly how the fire would spread, which areas of the ship would be safest, and which escape routes would become blocked by flames. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Eleanor's prophetic dreams was her ability to see individual faces of people she knew would die. The General Slocum carried many regular passengers, people who took these excursions frequently and had become familiar faces to Eleanor over the years. In her nightmares, she could see specific individuals being trapped by flames, drowning in the river, or crushed in the panic to escape. There was Mrs. O'Brien, an elderly Irish woman who always sat near the stern and knitted during the journey. In Eleanor's dream, she watched Mrs. O'Brien being overcome by smoke while trying to help a child find his parents. There was young Patrick Sullivan, a teenager who worked at the docks and sometimes took the excursions on his days off. Eleanor saw him jumping into the river to escape the flames, then disappearing beneath the surface because he'd never learned to swim properly. The emotional weight of watching these deaths, even in dreams, was crushing. Eleanor would wake up each morning feeling like she had actually witnessed these tragedies, actually lost these people she cared about. The grief was so real that she would sometimes find herself crying for hours after waking, mourning deaths that hadn't happened yet. Eleanor tried explaining her dreams to friends and family, hoping that someone would take them seriously enough to help her warn other potential passengers. But this was 1904, a time when women's concerns were often dismissed as hysteria, and dreams were considered even less credible as sources of information about real-world dangers. Her sister Margaret listened politely, but suggested that Eleanor was probably just anxious about the excursion and should perhaps take some calming tea before bedtime. Her neighbor, Mrs. Kelly, thought the dreams might be a sign that Eleanor needed to get out more and stop dwelling on morbid thoughts. Even her priest, Father Murphy, while sympathetic to her distress, gently suggested that she was probably reading too many sensational newspaper stories about disasters and letting them influence her sleep. The isolation of having such specific, terrifying knowledge while being unable to convince anyone else to take it seriously was almost as torturous as the dreams themselves. Eleanor found herself caught between her absolute certainty that disaster was coming and the rational understanding that she sounded like a madwoman when she tried to explain her visions. As the date of her scheduled excursion approached, Eleanor's anxiety reached unbearable levels. She would lie awake at night, dreading the moment when she would fall asleep and be forced to witness the General Slocum disaster again. During the day, she found herself constantly thinking about the faces she'd seen in her dreams, wondering if there was any way to save them. 3 days before the excursion, Eleanor made a decision that seemed completely irrational to everyone around her. She decided not to take the General Slocum trip, even though she had been looking forward to it for weeks and had already paid for her ticket. When people asked why she was canceling, she felt too embarrassed to mention the dreams, so she made up a story about feeling unwell. Her friends and family were disappointed, but not particularly concerned. They assumed Eleanor was having a bout of travel anxiety or perhaps coming down with a minor illness. No one suspected that she was canceling a pleasant afternoon excursion because she had repeatedly dreamed about watching dozens of people burn to death and drown. On June 15, 1904, the General Slocum caught fire during a routine excursion, exactly as Eleanor had dreamed. A small fire in the ship's forward compartment spread rapidly through the wooden vessel, which had been painted with flammable materials and was carrying illegal fireworks that accelerated the disaster. Over 1,000 passengers and crew members died in what became one of New York City's worst disasters before 9/11's. The fire spread in the exact pattern Eleanor had seen in her dreams. The storage area, where cleaning supplies were kept, ignited first, sending flames racing through the ship's wooden superstructure with terrifying speed. The ship's firefighting equipment was inadequate and poorly maintained. Some of the fire hoses were so rotted that they burst when crew members tried to use them, and many of the life preservers were filled with cheap cork that disintegrated when it got wet. Passengers jumped into the East River exactly as Eleanor had witnessed in her nightmares, and many drowned because they couldn't swim or because the defective life preservers failed to keep them afloat. The ship continued burning and drifting downstream while rescue boats tried frantically to reach survivors floating in the water. Every horrible detail of Eleanor's nightmare came true with documentary accuracy. The specific people she had seen dying in her dreams were among the casualties listed in the newspaper reports. Mrs. O'Brien was found overcome by smoke in the ship's main cabin, apparently having died while trying to help other passengers escape. Patrick Sullivan's body was pulled from the river 3 days later. He had drowned just as Eleanor had foreseen. When Eleanor read the newspaper accounts of the disaster, she felt a complex mixture of grief, relief, and profound guilt. She was grateful that her prophetic dreams had saved her own life, but she was tormented by the knowledge that she had somehow seen the deaths of people she cared about and hadn't been able to prevent their suffering. The psychological impact of having her nightmares proven accurate was devastating. Eleanor spent months in a state of confused mourning, grieving for people whose deaths she had witnessed in advance but been powerless to prevent. She questioned whether her dreams had been warnings meant to save lives or simply cosmic previews of tragedies that were already inevitable. What haunts me about Eleanor's story is how she spent the rest of her life, wondering if she could have somehow warned other passengers about what she'd seen in her dreams. Could she have saved lives if she'd been brave enough to tell people about her visions, even at the risk of seeming crazy? Or would people have dismissed her warnings just like they dismissed so many other prophetic dreamers throughout history? The General Slocum disaster led to significant changes in maritime safety regulations. Investigators discovered that the ship's safety equipment was grossly inadequate. Life preservers that fell apart when wet, fire hoses that burst under pressure, lifeboats that were painted shut and couldn't be launched. The tragedy sparked public outrage that led to stricter inspection requirements and better safety standards for passenger vessels. But Eleanor's prophetic dreams couldn't take credit for those improvements. Her visions had been specific enough to save her own life, but the social and cultural barriers that prevented people from taking women's concerns seriously meant that her warnings never reached the people who might have been able to prevent the disaster. Eleanor never took another pleasure cruise after the General Slocum disaster. She said that being on the water reminded her too much of the screams she'd heard in her dreams and the knowledge that she'd somehow glimpsed a future disaster that she couldn't prevent, even though her own prophetic dreams had saved her life. The really disturbing question that Eleanor's story raises is, how many disasters could be prevented if we had better systems for evaluating and acting on prophetic dreams? Her visions were incredibly specific and completely accurate, but the social structures of 1904 made it impossible for her warnings to be taken seriously by anyone in a position to do something about them. Modern researchers studying precognitive experiences have found that women report prophetic dreams at significantly higher rates than men, but historically, women's concerns about danger and safety have been dismissed as hysteria or overprotectiveness. Eleanor's case suggests that some of history's worst disasters might have been prevented if societies had been more willing to listen to prophetic dreamers, especially women whose warnings were often ignored or marginalized. The General Slocum tragedy also illustrates how prophetic dreams seem to be most accurate about emotionally significant events involving people the dreamer cares about. Eleanor's nightmares weren't just about abstract disaster, they were about watching specific individuals she knew suffer and die. The emotional connection seemed to enhance the accuracy and detail of her prophetic visions. What makes Eleanor's story particularly compelling is how it demonstrates the psychological burden that comes with prophetic knowledge. Having accurate dreams about future tragedies isn't a gift. It's a terrible responsibility that can be crushing when you're powerless to act on the information you've received. Eleanor lived with guilt for the rest of her life, wondering if there was something more she could have done to save the people whose deaths she had witnessed in advance. Her experience also highlights the isolation that comes with prophetic dreams. When you have detailed knowledge about future events that no one else believes or understands, you become profoundly alone with information that feels too important to ignore but too strange to share. Eleanor spent the week before the General Slocum disaster feeling like she was carrying a terrible secret that could save lives. If only she could find a way to make people listen. The tragedy also serves as a reminder that prophetic dreams, even when they're completely accurate, don't guarantee happy endings. Eleanor's visions saved her own life, but they couldn't prevent the disaster that killed the 1,000 people. Sometimes prophetic knowledge is limited to personal warnings rather than community-wide alerts, and the dreamer has to live with the knowledge that they escaped a fate that claimed many others. Eleanor's story continues to resonate today because it raises fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, time, and human intuition. How was her sleeping mind able to access detailed information about a future disaster? Was she somehow detecting subtle environmental cues that her conscious awareness missed, or was she genuinely seeing across time? The specificity and accuracy of her dreams suggest capabilities of human consciousness that we still don't fully understand. Going back to the American frontier in 1887, we have the remarkable case of Samuel Doc Morrison, a frontier doctor who traveled regularly between mining towns in Colorado, providing medical care to communities that were too small and remote to support their own physicians. Doc Morrison was tough as nails. He'd survived everything the frontier could throw at him, including Apache raids, mine cave-ins, flash floods, and more gunfights than most people see in movies. He was the kind of man who stitched up his own bullet wounds and kept working, who delivered babies during blizzards and performed surgery by candlelight. Nothing scared him, and nothing stopped him from getting to patients who needed his help. But in late August 1887, Doc started having dreams that shook him in ways that 20 years of frontier violence never had. He was supposed to take the weekly stagecoach from Denver to Lakeville, a routine trip he'd made hundreds of times to visit mining camps where his medical services were desperately needed. In his prophetic nightmare, Doc was sitting in his usual spot in the stagecoach, back corner, medical bag on his lap, trying to doze during the long, bumpy ride through mountain passes. The other passengers were typical for this route. A few miners heading back to work, a traveling salesman, maybe a woman visiting family in the mining camps. But somewhere in the mountain passes, Doc would hear something that made his blood run cold, the sound of many horses approaching fast, followed by gunshots and war cries. In his dream, he watched through the stagecoach window as a war party of Ute warriors surrounded the coach, forcing it to stop in a narrow canyon where there was no escape route. What made Doc's nightmare so specific and terrifying was his ability to see exactly how the attack would unfold. He watched the stagecoach driver and guard being shot down in the first volley. He saw the specific passengers who would try to run and be cut down by arrows and those who would survive long enough to be captured. He could see his own death in vivid detail, trying to use his medical bag as a shield while arrows pierced his chest and stomach. Now, let me give you the full horror of what Doc was experiencing, because these weren't just dreams, they were like being transported into a nightmare version of his own life. Picture a man who had dedicated his existence to healing people, who had sworn the Hippocratic oath to first do no harm, suddenly finding himself forced to witness detailed scenes of violence and death night after night. The sounds in Doc's dreams were particularly haunting. He could hear the specific war cries of individual Ute warriors, sounds he'd never heard in real life, but that felt absolutely authentic in his nightmares. There was the thundering of unshod horses' hooves on rocky ground, creating a percussion that seemed to shake the very earth. The crack of rifle fire mixed with the whistle of arrows cutting through mountain air created a symphony of death that Doc said was unlike anything he'd experienced even during the worst frontier conflicts he'd witnessed. But it was the human sounds that really tormented Doc. He could hear the stagecoach driver, a man named Pete Williams, whom Doc had known for 5 years, calling out warnings to his passengers before being silenced by gunfire. He heard Mrs. Sarah Bennett, a mining camp schoolteacher who sometimes traveled this route, screaming for her young son as arrows filled the air around them. The most disturbing part was hearing his own voice in the dream, not crying out in fear or pain, but trying to give medical instructions to wounded passengers even as he was dying. Doc's medical training made these nightmares particularly torturous because he could diagnose his own wounds and those of other passengers with clinical precision. He knew exactly how long each person would survive based on their injuries, which wounds would be immediately fatal, and which would lead to slow, agonizing deaths. For a man whose life's work was saving people, being forced to watch helplessly as everyone around him died was psychological torture beyond description. The setting of these dreams was incredibly specific. Doc saw the attack happening in a narrow canyon called Devil's Throat, about 30 miles west of Denver. He traveled through this canyon many times and knew it well. The walls were steep and rocky, with no side passages where a stagecoach could maneuver to escape pursuit. In his dreams, he could see specific rock formations, particular pine trees, even the exact spot where the trail curved around a massive boulder that would provide perfect cover for an ambush. What made these visions even more disturbing was Doc's ability to see the attack from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Sometimes he was inside the stagecoach, experiencing the terror of being trapped in a wooden box while arrows and bullets penetrated the walls around him. Other times he seemed to be floating above the scene, watching the entire ambush unfold like some kind of cosmic observer documenting a tragedy for posterity. In some versions of the dream, Doc could see individual Ute warriors with photographic clarity. There was a young brave with distinctive white paint across his forehead and cheeks, carrying a rifle that looked like an old Spencer carbine. Another warrior rode a paint horse with unusual markings, a white blaze that extended all the way down to the animal's nose. Doc had never seen these specific individuals in real life, but their faces were burned into his memory with impossible detail. The most disturbing aspect of Doc's dream was his professional medical knowledge of exactly how each person would die. He could see the precise wounds, estimate how long each victim would survive, and understand exactly what kind of pain they would experience. For a man who had dedicated his life to healing, watching himself and his fellow passengers being systematically killed was psychological torture. Doc had this same nightmare for 4 consecutive nights, and each time the details became more specific and more disturbing. He could see the faces of individual warriors, the specific location in the canyon where the attack would occur, even the time of day based on the angle of shadows on the rocky walls. By the 4th night, Doc felt like he had lived through this attack so many times that he could probably draw a detailed map of exactly where each body would fall. The psychological impact of these dreams was devastating. Doc had always prided himself on his rational, scientific approach to medicine and life. He believed in observable facts, logical diagnosis, and practical solutions to problems. But these nightmares were forcing him to confront the possibility that his mind was accessing information through channels that science couldn't explain. Doc tried discussing his dreams with a few trusted friends, but the responses were mixed at best. His closest colleague, Dr. James Murphy, suggested that the stress of frontier medical practice was finally catching up with him and recommended a vacation back east to restore his nervous system. The local sheriff, Tom Bradley, listened politely but clearly thought Doc was developing the kind of mountain fever that sometimes affected men who spent too much time in isolated conditions. Even Doc's own rational mind was rebelling against what he was experiencing. During the day, he would tell himself that the dreams were just his subconscious processing the very real dangers of frontier travel, combined with fatigue from his demanding medical practice. But at night, when he was forced to live through the Canyon Creek massacre again and again, the dreams felt more real than his waking life. The isolation was brutal. Doc couldn't discuss the technical details of his nightmares with most people, because they lacked the medical knowledge to understand what he was describing. He couldn't talk about the emotional impact without seeming weak or unstable. And he certainly couldn't suggest canceling his medical rounds to the mining camps based on prophetic dreams, without damaging his reputation as a reliable physician. On the morning he was supposed to catch the stagecoach to Leadville, Doc Morrison made a decision that went against everything he believed about duty and helping people. He sent a telegram to the mining camps, explaining that he was too ill to make the trip and would reschedule for the following week. This decision was agonizing for Doc because he knew there were people in those mining camps who genuinely needed medical care. There was old Henrik Larson, whose diabetes was getting worse and who needed his insulin dosage adjusted. There was Maria Santos, who was expecting her 4th child and had experienced complications with her previous pregnancies. There was young Tommy O'Brien, who had been injured in a mine accident and needed follow-up treatment for his broken leg. Doc spent the day pacing around his small clinic in Denver, alternating between relief that he wasn't traveling and guilt about abandoning his patients. He kept telling himself that postponing the trip by 1 week wouldn't make a significant difference in anyone's treatment. But he also knew that in frontier medicine, timing could be the difference between life and death. 3 days later, the weekly stagecoach to Leadville was attacked by a war party of Ute warriors in exactly the location Doc had seen in his dreams. Every passenger and crew member was killed in what became known as the Canyon Creek Massacre. The attack happened at the precise time and in the exact manner Doc had experienced in his nightmares. When Doc heard about the massacre, he was overwhelmed with a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that his prophetic dreams had saved his life was mixed with grief for the people who had died and guilt about his patients in the mining camps who still needed medical care. But he was also profoundly disturbed by the realization that his dreams had been completely accurate predictions of a future event. The details of the Canyon Creek Massacre, as reported in the territorial newspapers, matched Doc's nightmares with impossible precision. The attack had occurred in Devil's Throat Canyon, exactly where he'd seen it in his dreams. The stagecoach driver, Pete Williams, had been killed in the first volley of gunfire. Just as Doc had witnessed, Mrs. Sarah Bennett, the schoolteacher, had died trying to protect a young boy who turned out to be the son of one of the miners. Even the specific time of day matched Doc's visions. The attack had occurred in late afternoon, when the shadows were long and the canyon walls created the perfect conditions for an ambush. The territorial investigators found evidence that the war party had been waiting in the exact positions Doc had seen in his dreams, using the same rock formations for cover. What made the newspaper accounts particularly chilling for Doc was reading about the specific warriors who had participated in the attack. The territorial militia had tracked down some of the raiders, and their descriptions matched the faces Doc had seen in his nightmares. There was indeed a young Ute, brave with distinctive white face paint, and one of the warriors had been riding a paint horse with unusual markings. The psychological impact of having his prophetic dreams proven accurate was almost as traumatic as experiencing the Canyon Creek massacre itself would have been. Doc spent weeks in a state of confused guilt, questioning whether his dreams had been warnings meant to save lives or just cosmic previews of tragedies that were already inevitable. He wrestled with profound questions about fate, free will, and moral responsibility. If he had somehow known in advance that the attack was going to happen, did he have an obligation to try to prevent it? But how could he have warned anyone without seeming like a madman? And would anyone have believed warnings based on prophetic dreams? Doc also struggled with survivor's guilt. Why had his dreams saved him while allowing 7 other innocent people to die? Was there some cosmic reason why his life was worth preserving while others were expendable? Or was he simply the lucky recipient of a random warning that he'd been wise enough to heed? The Canyon Creek massacre had broader implications for frontier politics. The attack led to increased military patrols in the Colorado Territory and contributed to rising tensions between white settlers and Native American tribes. Doc found himself in the strange position of being a witness to historical events that he had experienced in advance through dreams, but he couldn't share this knowledge with anyone who might have used it to prevent the tragedy. Doc continued practicing frontier medicine for another 20 years after the Canyon Creek experience, but he never again ignored vivid, specific dreams about his travels. He developed an informal system for checking his nightmares against his medical rounds, and he would quietly reschedule appointments or change routes whenever he had particularly disturbing travel-related dreams. His colleagues never knew about this practice, but Doc credited it with helping him maintain both his sanity and his safety throughout the rest of his frontier career. He said the Canyon Creek experience taught him that sometimes the best way to help people is to stay alive, even when your rational mind can't explain why you're avoiding danger that seems unlikely or impossible. In his later years, Doc would sometimes tell trusted friends about the importance of paying attention to vivid, recurring dreams, especially ones that involved specific details about future events. Your sleeping mind knows things your waking mind hasn't figured out yet, he would say. Sometimes the only difference between life and death is whether you're brave enough to trust what your dreams are trying to tell you. Doc's story became part of local frontier folklore, passed down through generations of Colorado families as an example of how prophetic dreams could save lives in dangerous times. But Doc himself always emphasized that the most important lesson wasn't about supernatural prediction, it was about trusting your deepest instincts. Even when they contradicted social expectations and rational thinking, the Canyon Creek massacre also illustrates something fascinating about prophetic dreams related to violent conflicts. Unlike dreams about mechanical failures or natural disasters, these visions often include detailed information about human behavior, specific individuals, and complex social dynamics. Doc's dreams weren't just about abstract violence, they were about particular people, making specific choices in response to dangerous situations. Modern researchers studying precognitive experiences have found that dreams about human conflicts tend to be among the most emotionally intense and psychologically disturbing categories of prophetic visions. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Our ancestors who could somehow sense impending violence would have had significant survival advantages, even if they couldn't explain how their warning systems worked. Doc Morrison's experience suggests that prophetic dreams might be most accurate when they involve life or death situations that trigger our deepest survival instincts. His nightmares weren't just random anxieties about frontier dangers, they were specific warnings about a particular threat that his unconscious mind had somehow detected in advance. The Canyon Creek story also demonstrates how prophetic dreams can carry profound moral burdens. Doc saved his own life by trusting his nightmares, but he also lived with the knowledge that other people had died in the exact disaster he had foreseen. This kind of survivor's guilt is common among people who experience accurate prophetic dreams about tragedies they cannot prevent. Our final primary story takes us to 1915 and involves Margaret Brennan, an Irish-American woman who had saved money for 2 years to book passage on the Lusitania for a trip to visit family in Cork. This was the journey of a lifetime for Margaret. She'd never been back to Ireland since emigrating as a child, and she was finally going to see relatives she hadn't met in decades. The Lusitania was everything the Titanic had been advertised to be, but actually delivered on luxurious, fast, and considered completely safe for civilian passengers. Even though World War I was raging in Europe, passenger ships were supposedly protected by international law, and no one seriously believed that Germany would torpedo a civilian vessel carrying American passengers. But starting in late April 1915, Margaret began having dreams that turned her anticipated joyful reunion into a vision of underwater death. In her nightmare, she was standing on the deck of the Lusitania, watching the Irish coastline appear in the distance. She could see other passengers pointing excitedly at the approaching shore, talking about how eager they were to reach land after days at sea. Then, without warning, Margaret would hear a sound she described as like the world's largest door slamming shut underwater. A massive explosion would rock the ship, followed immediately by a second explosion that seemed to come from deep within the vessel's hull. In her dream, she watched the magnificent Lusitania begin listing severely to one side, taking on water so rapidly that it was obviously going to sink within minutes rather than hours. The most terrifying aspect of Margaret's nightmare was seeing how quickly everything went wrong. Unlike the Titanic, which took hours to sink, the Lusitania in her dream went down in less than 20 minutes. Passengers barely had time to understand what was happening before they were fighting for their lives in the cold North Atlantic water. Now, let me take you deep into the psychological horror that Margaret was experiencing. Because these weren't just dreams, they were like being forced to watch a documentary of her own death every single night. Picture waking up repeatedly with the taste of salt water in your mouth, the sensation of drowning filling your lungs, and the absolute certainty that you had just witnessed your own future murder. Margaret's dreams were so immersive that she would often wake up coughing and gasping, convinced that she was actually drowning. She could feel the icy North Atlantic water closing over her head, could taste the salt and oil that contaminated the ocean around the sinking ship. The physical sensations were so real that she would sometimes spend several minutes after waking trying to convince herself that she was safe in her own bed rather than dying in the ocean off the Irish coast. In her nightmare, Margaret could see specific details that seemed impossible for her to know through any normal means. She watched a German U-boat surface near the Lusitania, its periscope breaking through the calm ocean surface like the fin of some mechanical shark. She could see the torpedo being fired, a silver streak, cutting through the clear water toward the passenger ship's hull with deadly precision. What made Margaret's prophetic dreams particularly disturbing was her ability to see the attack from multiple perspectives. Sometimes she was on the Lusitania's deck, experiencing the terror of passengers who had no idea what was happening. Other times she seemed to be underwater, watching the torpedo approach the ship's hull and seeing the massive explosion that would tear the vessel apart from the inside. The sounds in Margaret's dreams were particularly haunting. She could hear the initial explosion, a deep, resonant boom that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. Then came the secondary explosion, louder and more destructive, as whatever the ship was carrying in its cargo holds detonated with devastating force. The combination of these two explosions created a sound that Margaret said was like hearing the world end. But it was the human sounds that really tormented Margaret. She could hear specific passengers screaming as they realized the ship was sinking. There was a young mother calling desperately for her children who had been separated from her in the chaos. There was an elderly man praying loudly in what sounded like German or Yiddish as he tried to help other passengers into lifeboats. Margaret could even hear the ship's band continuing to play music, trying to keep passengers calm even as the deck tilted at increasingly impossible angles. In her dream, Margaret could see the specific cause of the disaster with technical precision that seemed impossible for a civilian passenger to possess. The torpedo had struck the ship in exactly the right location to cause maximum damage, hitting near the ammunition storage areas in the forward cargo hold. The secondary explosion wasn't just from the torpedo. It was from military supplies that the supposedly civilian passenger ship was secretly carrying to Britain as part of the war effort. Margaret's prophetic dreams also included incredibly specific details about which passengers would survive and which would die. She could see families being separated as the ship listed to one side, with some members making it to lifeboats while others were trapped below decks. She watched children being trampled in the panic to reach the boat deck, elderly passengers being pushed aside by younger, stronger travelers desperate to save themselves. The most psychologically devastating aspect of Margaret's nightmares was her repeated experience of her own death. In some versions of the dream, she drowned when the ship's suction pulled her underwater as it sank. In others, she was crushed by debris falling from the ship's superstructure. But in every version, she died alone in the cold ocean, far from the Irish family she had been so excited to see. Margaret tried discussing these dreams with her family and friends, but the responses were uniformly dismissive. Her sister Catherine thought the dreams were just anxiety about the long ocean voyage, especially during wartime. Her parish priest, Father O'Malley, suggested that she was probably reading too many newspaper stories about the war and letting them influence her sleep. Even her own rational mind rebelled against what she was experiencing. During the day, Margaret would tell herself that the dreams were just her subconscious processing very reasonable fears about traveling across the Atlantic while German submarines were prowling the shipping lanes. But at night, when she was forced to experience the Lusitania disaster again and again, the visions felt more real and more urgent than her waking life. The timing of Margaret's prophetic dreams was particularly disturbing. They began exactly 3 weeks before her scheduled departure date, and they occurred every single night without variation. The consistency was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was as if her subconscious mind was running the same disaster simulation repeatedly, trying to burn the warning into her memory so deeply that she couldn't ignore it. What made these dreams even more terrifying was Margaret's growing ability to see specific individuals who would be affected by the disaster. She began dreaming about Alfred Vanderbilt, the wealthy American businessman who was also sailing on the Lusitania's final voyage. She could see him helping other passengers into lifeboats before going down with the ship, dying like a gentleman even though he could have easily saved himself. Margaret had never met Vanderbilt and wouldn't have recognized him on the street, but in her dreams she could see his face with photographic clarity. She watched him giving his life jacket to a young mother with children, then standing calmly on the deck as the ship went down around him. The specificity of these visions about a person she'd never met was deeply unsettling. She also dreamed about Captain William Turner, the Lusitania's commander, standing on the bridge as his ship was torpedoed. In her nightmare, she could see his face as he realized that his vessel was doomed, not just surprised or concerned, but absolutely devastated by the knowledge that he was about to lose over 1,000 passengers to an active war. Margaret could hear him giving orders to launch lifeboats even though he knew there wasn't enough time to save everyone. The technical details in Margaret's dreams were impossibly accurate for someone with no naval or military experience. She could see exactly how the torpedo would damage the ship's hull, which compartments would flood first, and why the Lusitania would sink so much faster than other ships of similar size. Her sleeping mind somehow understood that the ship's design made it particularly vulnerable to this type of attack, with features intended for speed and luxury that became deadly liabilities when the vessel was damaged. Margaret also dreamed about the aftermath of the sinking with disturbing precision. She could see rescue ships arriving hours too late, pulling bodies and survivors from the cold Atlantic water. She watched Irish fishermen and British naval vessels working together to recover the dead and care for the traumatized living. She even saw specific locations along the Irish coast where bodies would wash ashore, beaches that would be transformed into temporary morgues and grave sites. As her departure date approached, Margaret's anxiety reached unbearable levels. She was caught between her lifelong dream of returning to Ireland and her absolute certainty that boarding the Lusitania would mean death. The financial sacrifice involved in canceling the trip was enormous. She had saved for 2 years to afford the passage, working extra shifts at the textile mill and denying herself even small luxuries to accumulate the necessary funds. But the psychological pressure of the dreams was becoming unbearable. Margaret found herself unable to concentrate at work, unable to enjoy time with friends and family, unable to think about anything except the disaster she was convinced was coming. She would lie awake at night, dreading the moment when she would fall asleep and be forced to experience the Lusitania sinking again. Margaret's family began to worry about her mental state. She had always been a cheerful, optimistic person who looked forward to new experiences and adventures. But the prophetic dreams were transforming her into someone who seemed haunted by knowledge she couldn't share or explain. Her sister Catherine later said that it was like watching Margaret slowly disappear, replaced by someone who carried a terrible secret that was eating her alive from the inside. 3 days before her scheduled departure, Margaret made a decision that seemed completely irrational to everyone around her but felt absolutely necessary to her survival instincts. She went to the Cunard Line office and canceled her passage on the Lusitania, forfeiting her entire investment rather than board a ship she was convinced would be torpedoed. The Cunard Line representative was sympathetic but confused. "Miss Brennan," he said, "the Lusitania is the safest and fastest ship on the Atlantic. You have nothing to worry about from German submarines. They wouldn't dare attack a passenger vessel carrying American citizens." But Margaret's conviction was absolute. She told him, "I've seen this ship sinking in my dreams every night for 3 weeks. I know exactly how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and where it's going to happen. I would rather lose my money than lose my life." The clerk probably thought Margaret was having some kind of nervous breakdown, but he processed her cancellation and refunded what he could of her fare. Margaret walked out of the office feeling simultaneously relieved and devastated. She had probably saved her own life, but she had also given up her dream of returning to Ireland. On May 7, 1915, the Lusitania was torpedoed by German U-boat U-20 off the coast of Ireland, exactly as Margaret had dreamed. The ship sank in just 18 minutes, killing 1,198 passengers and crew, including 128 Americans. The attack happened at the precise location and time Margaret had seen in her nightmares, and the ship's rapid sinking was caused by a secondary explosion, probably ammunition in the cargo hold, just as she had witnessed in her dreams. Every detail of Margaret's prophetic nightmare proved accurate with documentary precision. The torpedo struck the ship's starboard side near the forward cargo holds, causing the exact type of damage she had foreseen. The secondary explosion was indeed caused by military supplies that the supposedly civilian passenger ship was secretly carrying to Britain. The ship listed severely to starboard and sank bow first in less than 20 minutes, exactly as Margaret had experienced in her dreams. Alfred Vanderbilt died exactly as Margaret had seen in her visions. He gave his life jacket to a young mother and went down with the ship. His body never recovered. Captain Turner survived, but hundreds of passengers were trapped below decks or swept away by the ship's suction as it sank. The rescue efforts unfolded exactly as Margaret had dreamed, with Irish fishermen and British naval vessels arriving too late to save most of the victims. When Margaret read the newspaper accounts of the Lusitania disaster, she felt a complex mixture of vindication, grief, and profound isolation. Her prophetic dreams had been completely accurate, but this knowledge brought her no satisfaction, only the terrible understanding that she had somehow witnessed in advance one of the most shocking maritime disasters in history. The psychological impact of having her nightmares proven correct was devastating. Margaret spent months in a state of confused mourning. grieving for people she had never met but whose death she had experienced repeatedly in her dreams. She questioned whether her visions had been warnings meant to save lives or simply cosmic previews of tragedies that were already inevitable. Margaret's case became known to a small circle of researchers interested in prophetic dreams, but she never spoke publicly about her experience. The social stigma of claiming to have predicted a major disaster through dreams would have been enormous, especially for a working-class Irish-American woman whose credibility was already suspect in the eyes of many people. She never attempted another transatlantic voyage. The Lusitania experience had shattered her faith in the safety of ocean travel and left her with a profound fear of ignoring her own prophetic dreams. Margaret said later that she would rather live with the regret of missing her trip to Ireland than with the knowledge that she had ignored a warning that could have saved her life. The sinking of the Lusitania became one of the key events that eventually drew America into World War I. Margaret found herself in the strange position of having witnessed in advance, through her dreams, an attack that would help change the course of world history. But she could never discuss this knowledge publicly without seeming like either a fraud or a madwoman. Margaret's prophetic dreams about the Lusitania raise fascinating questions about the relationship between individual consciousness and historical events. How was her sleeping mind able to access detailed information about a future attack that would have profound political and military consequences? Was she somehow detecting early intelligence about German submarine operations, or was she genuinely seeing across time to witness a disaster before it happened? The specificity and accuracy of her visions suggest capabilities of human awareness that we still don't fully understand. Margaret's dreams weren't just vague anxieties about wartime travel. They were detailed documentaries of a specific disaster, complete with technical information about ship design, military tactics, and individual human behavior under extreme stress. Her experience also demonstrates the terrible psychological burden that comes with prophetic knowledge. Margaret saved her own life by trusting her dreams, but she also lived with the knowledge that she had somehow foreseen the deaths of over 1,000 people and been powerless to prevent their suffering. The isolation of carrying such knowledge, being unable to share it or use it to help others, was almost as traumatic as the dreams themselves. Margaret lived until 1962, long enough to see 2 world wars and numerous other maritime disasters. She never again experienced prophetic dreams as detailed or accurate as her Lusitania visions, as if her unconscious mind had fulfilled its purpose and could finally rest. But she remained convinced for the rest of her life that some people are occasionally granted glimpses of future events, usually involving dangers that their conscious minds couldn't predict or prevent. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that prophetic dreams, even when they save lives, often come with profound moral and psychological costs. The ability to see future tragedies doesn't necessarily confer the power to prevent them, and the knowledge of what's coming can be as much a curse as a blessing. You know, not all prophetic travel dreams involve famous disasters that make it into history books. Sometimes they're about smaller tragedies, more personal near misses that never get documented, but are just as real and just as life-saving for the people who experience them. Take the case of Henry Walsh, a traveling merchant in rural Ireland in 1923. Henry made his living moving goods between small towns and villages, following routes that hadn't changed much in generations. He knew every road, every bridge, every shortcut in his territory like they were extensions of his own property. But one night in October, Henry had a dream that was so specific and so disturbing that it made him question everything he thought he knew about his familiar travel routes. In the dream, he was driving his horse-drawn wagon across the old stone bridge at Kilpatrick's Crossing, a bridge he'd crossed safely hundreds of times over the years. In his nightmare, Henry was halfway across the bridge when he heard a deep, grinding sound coming from the stone structure beneath him. He looked down and saw cracks appearing in the bridge's ancient stonework, spreading like lightning across the surface. Before he could react, the entire center section of the bridge collapsed into the river below, taking Henry, his horse, and his wagon into the dark water. The dream was so vivid that Henry could feel the cold water closing over his head, could taste the muddy river water filling his lungs, could see his horse struggling desperately in the swift current. He woke up gasping and coughing, absolutely convinced for several minutes that he was actually drowning. Now, here's what made Henry's experience particularly unsettling. This wasn't just anxiety about crossing water or general fear about bridge safety. Henry had specific technical knowledge about stone bridge construction that he'd picked up over years of traveling, and in his dream he could see exactly which structural elements were failing and why. The cracks weren't random, they followed the mortar lines between stones, indicating that freeze-thaw cycles had been gradually weakening the bridge's foundation for years. Henry could see in his nightmare that the bridge's center arch was bearing too much weight, because supporting pillars in the riverbed had been undermined by spring flooding. He watched the keystone, the crucial wedge-shaped stone at the top of the arch, shift slightly under pressure, creating a cascade of structural failure that brought down the entire center span in a matter of seconds. What made this dream particularly disturbing was Henry's ability to experience the collapse from multiple perspectives. Sometimes he was on the bridge feeling it give way beneath him. Other times he seemed to be floating above the scene watching the disaster unfold like some kind of engineering documentary. He could see exactly how the falling stones would trap anyone unfortunate enough to be crossing at the wrong moment. Henry had used Kilpatrick's crossing twice a week for 15 years without any problems. The bridge was old, but it seemed solid and reliable. Local people had been crossing it for generations without incident, and there was no reason to think it might be dangerous. But the dream felt so real, so specific, that Henry decided to take a different route on his next trip, even though it would add several hours to his journey. The alternative route meant crossing the river at Murphy's Ford, about 5 miles upstream, where the water was shallow enough for wagons during dry weather. It was a much less convenient crossing. The approaches were steep and muddy, and Henry would have to unload his wagon and carry his goods across by hand if the water level was too high. But something about his nightmare made him willing to accept the inconvenience rather than risk crossing Kilpatrick's bridge. Henry's wife thought he was being ridiculously overcautious. "You've crossed that bridge 1,000 times without problems," she pointed out. "Why would you suddenly start worrying about it now?" But Henry couldn't shake the image of those cracks spreading across the stonework, couldn't forget the sound of the bridge collapsing into the river. 3 days later, Kilpatrick's bridge collapsed during a sudden flood, exactly as Henry had dreamed. A local farmer's cart had been crossing at the time, and both the farmer and his horse drowned when the center section of the bridge gave way. If Henry had followed his normal route, he would have been on that bridge at approximately the same time, since he always made his weekly rounds on the same schedule. The collapse happened exactly as Henry had envisioned it. The center arch gave way first, taking the keystone with it and causing a cascade of structural failure that sent massive stones crashing into the river below. The official investigation later determined that the bridge had been weakened by years of freeze-thaw damage to the mortar, combined with recent flooding that had undermined the foundation pillars. What I find fascinating about Henry's story is that it shows how prophetic dreams can save people from disasters that never make headlines. Tragedies that only affect a few individuals but are just as devastating to the families involved. Sometimes your subconscious early warning system is protecting you from dangers that no one else will ever hear about. Henry continued his merchant routes for another 20 years, but he never again ignored vivid dreams about infrastructure problems or travel hazards. He said the Kilpatrick's Bridge experience taught him that our minds might be constantly monitoring structural integrity and safety conditions in ways that our conscious awareness doesn't recognize. Moving forward to 1936, there's the case of Catherine Murphy, a schoolteacher who lived on one of the small islands off the coast of Maine. Catherine depended on the weekly ferry to get supplies and visit the mainland for medical appointments and other necessities that weren't available on her remote island home. The ferry service was reliable but basic, an old wooden boat that had been making the same route for decades, operated by a captain who knew these waters like his own backyard. It wasn't luxurious, but it was dependable, and the island community trusted it completely. But in early March 1936, Catherine started having dreams about the ferry that was so disturbing she began to dread the weekly trips she'd always enjoyed. In her nightmare, she was sitting in her usual spot near the stern, reading a book while the ferry made its way back to the island through choppy seas. In the dream, Catherine would suddenly notice that the engine sounds were wrong instead of the steady, reliable rhythm she was used to. There would be irregular sputtering and grinding noises that suggested serious mechanical problems. She would see the captain looking worried and trying different controls, but nothing would restore the engine to normal operation. Then, in her nightmare, the engine would die completely, leaving the ferry drifting helplessly in increasingly rough seas. Catherine could see massive waves approaching the disabled vessel, each one larger and more dangerous than the last. She watched the ferry being pushed toward the rocky cliffs of a small, uninhabited island, with no power to steer away from the deadly shore. The most terrifying part of Catherine's dream was her realization that the ferry's radio equipment wasn't working either. They were stranded in rough seas with no way to call for help, being driven inexorably toward rocks that would smash the wooden hull to pieces. She could see the specific rocks they would hit, could hear the sound of the wooden hull splitting apart, could feel the icy main water rushing in around her feet. Now let me paint you the full picture of what Catherine was experiencing, because these dreams weren't just scary, they were like being trapped in a maritime disaster movie that played in her head every single night. The sensory details were so vivid that she would wake up with the taste of salt water in her mouth and the sound of splintering wood still echoing in her ears. Catherine could see every detail of the ferry's mechanical failure with impossible precision. In her dreams, she watched the engine's cooling system fail first, causing the temperature gauges to climb into the red zone. Then the fuel lines would start leaking, creating a dangerous fire hazard that the crew couldn't control. The electrical system would short out next, killing not just the radio, but also the navigation lights and emergency equipment. What made these nightmares particularly disturbing was Catherine's ability to see the disaster unfold from multiple perspectives. Sometimes she was in the passenger cabin, experiencing the growing panic as people realized the ferry was in serious trouble. Other times she seemed to be floating above the scene, watching the disabled vessel being driven toward the rocks by wind and current like a toy boat in a bathtub. Catherine could see specific passengers who would be on that fatal trip, and she knew exactly how each person would react to the emergency. There was old Henrik Larsson, the retired fisherman who would try to help the captain restore engine power. There was young Mary Sullivan, the postmistress's daughter, who would panic and try to jump overboard before the ferry hit the rocks. There was Father McKenna, the island's priest, who would lead prayers while helping other passengers prepare for impact. The technical details in Catherine's dreams were impossibly accurate for someone with no maritime experience. She could see exactly which part of the engine would fail first, how the cooling system breakdown would cascade into total mechanical failure, and why the backup systems wouldn't be able to compensate. Her sleeping mind somehow understood the ferry's mechanical vulnerabilities in ways that her conscious awareness couldn't match. Catherine also dreamed about the weather conditions that would make the disaster inevitable. She saw specific wind patterns, wave heights, and current directions that would combine to push the disabled ferry toward the rocks with unstoppable force. The storm wasn't dramatic, it was just rough enough to be dangerous for a boat with no engine, but calm enough that passengers wouldn't initially realize how much trouble they were in. What made Catherine's prophetic dreams even more disturbing was her ability to see the rescue attempts that would fail. She watched Coast Guard vessels trying to reach the ferry, but they would arrive too late because the distress call never went out. She saw local fishermen hearing the sounds of the wreck and rushing to help, but the rocky shoreline where the ferry would crash was too dangerous for small boats to approach. Catherine had this nightmare 3 times in 1 week, and each time the details became more specific. She could see exactly which passengers would survive the shipwreck and which would drown in the freezing water. The images were so vivid that she started feeling guilty about her fellow passengers' deaths before they'd even happened. The psychological impact of these dreams was devastating. Catherine had always been a practical, no-nonsense school teacher who believed in facts and evidence rather than superstition and folklore. But these nightmares were forcing her to confront the possibility that her mind was accessing information through channels that rational thinking couldn't explain. Catherine tried discussing her dreams with a few trusted friends, but the responses were predictably skeptical. The island doctor, Dr. Morrison, suggested that she was probably working too hard and needed more rest. The local minister, Reverend Adams, listened politely but clearly thought Catherine was letting her imagination run away with her. Even her closest friend, Sarah Mitchell, gently suggested that Catherine might be reading too many adventure novels and letting them influence her sleep. The isolation was brutal. Catherine couldn't share the technical details of her nightmares with most people because they lacked the knowledge to understand what she was describing. She couldn't discuss the emotional impact without seeming unstable or overly dramatic. And she certainly couldn't suggest avoiding the ferry based on prophetic dreams without damaging her reputation as a rational, professional educator. As the date of her scheduled mainland trip approached, Catherine's anxiety reached unbearable levels. She needed to visit the mainland for a dental appointment that had been scheduled for months, and postponing it would mean waiting another month for the next available appointment. But her nightmares had been so vivid and so consistent that she couldn't bring herself to board the ferry. On the day she was supposed to take the ferry to the mainland for a dental appointment, Catherine made an excuse about feeling too ill to travel. She canceled her appointment and stayed on the island, even though it meant postponing necessary medical care. That afternoon, the ferry experienced exactly the mechanical failures Catherine had dreamed about. The engine died in rough seas, the radio malfunctioned, and the disabled vessel was driven onto the rocks of Bear Island. 2 passengers drowned, and the others spent a terrifying night clinging to the wreckage before being rescued the next morning. If Catherine had been aboard, she would almost certainly have been one of the casualties. The engine failure happened exactly as Catherine had seen in her dreams: cooling system breakdown, fuel line leaks, electrical failure, and complete loss of power. The ferry was pushed toward the rocks by the same wind and current patterns she had envisioned, and the rescue attempts were delayed because no distress signal had been sent. Old Henrik Larsen did try to help restore engine power, exactly as Catherine had foreseen, but he suffered a heart attack from the stress and died before rescue arrived. Young Mary Sullivan panicked and tried to jump overboard, just as Catherine had dreamed, but was pulled back by other passengers who probably saved her life. Father McKenna did lead prayers and help people prepare for impact, remaining calm and reassuring even as the ferry was being battered against the rocks. When Catherine heard about the disaster, she felt a complex mixture of relief, guilt, and profound confusion. Her prophetic dreams had been completely accurate, but this knowledge brought her no satisfaction. Only the terrible understanding that she had somehow witnessed in advance a tragedy that killed 2 people she cared about. The psychological impact of having her nightmares proven correct was almost as traumatic as experiencing the shipwreck itself would have been. Catherine spent weeks in a state of confused mourning, wondering if there was something more she could have done to prevent the disaster. Could she have convinced the ferry operators to postpone the trip? Could she have warned her fellow passengers about the specific dangers she had foreseen? But Catherine also realized that her prophetic dreams had limitations. They had shown her the disaster in vivid detail, but they hadn't given her the social or professional authority to act on that information in ways that could have prevented the tragedy. As a school teacher on a remote island, her warnings about mechanical problems and maritime safety would have been dismissed as female hysteria or amateur meddling in technical matters she didn't understand. After that experience, Catherine always paid attention to her dreams before traveling. She said that nightmare taught her that sometimes our subconscious minds pick up on subtle warning signs, changes in engine sounds, weather patterns, or mechanical vibrations that our conscious minds ignore or dismiss. Catherine developed an informal system for evaluating her travel-related dreams. Vivid, specific nightmares that repeated multiple times were taken seriously and acted upon. Vague, anxiety dreams or single scary images were noted, but didn't necessarily change her plans. She found that this approach helped her distinguish between normal travel anxiety and genuine prophetic warnings. The ferry disaster led to significant changes in maritime safety regulations for small passenger vessels serving remote communities. Investigators found that the ferry's backup systems were inadequate, the radio equipment was poorly maintained, and the crew hadn't received proper emergency training. New requirements for redundant safety systems and crew certification were implemented throughout the region. But Catherine's prophetic dreams couldn't take credit for those improvements. Her visions had been accurate enough to save her own life, but the social barriers that prevented women's technical concerns from being taken seriously meant that her warnings never reached the people who might have been able to prevent the disaster. Catherine continued teaching on the island for another 30 years, but she never again took the ferry service for granted. She would always check her dreams against her travel plans, and she would quietly change her schedule whenever she had disturbing maritime nightmares. Her colleagues and students never knew about this practice, but Catherine credited it with helping her avoid several other potential accidents over the years. What I find most fascinating about Catherine's story is how it demonstrates the practical limitations of prophetic dreams as a warning system. She had incredibly specific and accurate information about a future disaster, but the social and cultural context of 1930s island life made it impossible for her to act on that information in ways that could have helped others. Catherine's experience also illustrates how prophetic dreams seem to be most accurate when they involve emotionally significant events in familiar environments. The ferry wasn't just transportation for Catherine, it was her lifeline to the outside world, and she had intimate knowledge of its sounds, rhythms, and mechanical quirks. Her emotional connection to the vessel and her detailed familiarity with its normal operation may have enhanced her ability to detect subtle signs of impending mechanical failure. The technical accuracy of Catherine's dreams is particularly striking. She had no formal training in marine engineering, but her nightmares included detailed information about engine cooling systems, electrical circuits, and hull design that proved completely accurate. This suggests that prophetic dreams might involve more than just emotional intuition. They may also include sophisticated technical analysis that operates below the level of conscious awareness. Catherine's story also demonstrates the psychological burden that comes with accurate prophetic dreams about disasters you can't prevent. She lived with guilt for years, wondering if she could have found a way to save Henrik Larsson and the other passenger who died in the ferry wreck. The knowledge that her dreams had been prophetic was both validating and torturous. It confirmed that her experience had been real, but it also meant that she had somehow witnessed preventable deaths in advance. Throughout history, different cultures have had fascinating approaches to understanding and utilizing prophetic dreams about travel and danger. What we call paranormal experiences were often considered essential survival tools by our ancestors, who lived much closer to natural dangers and had to rely more heavily on subtle environmental cues and intuitive warning systems. Ancient seafaring cultures were particularly sophisticated about dream-based navigation and danger avoidance. The Polynesian navigators who colonized the Pacific Islands had elaborate systems for interpreting dreams about ocean conditions, weather patterns, and safe routes between distant islands. They believed that experienced navigators could dream sail their routes before making actual voyages, identifying dangerous currents, storms, and other hazards that might not be visible during daytime travel. These weren't just superstitious beliefs. Modern analysis of Polynesian navigation techniques suggests that their dream practices may have helped them unconsciously process complex environmental information about wind patterns, ocean swells, and seasonal weather changes. Their brains were essentially running sophisticated predictive models during sleep, combining subtle sensory information with decades of sailing experience to identify probable future conditions. The Vikings had similar practices, consulting what they called dream seers before major voyages. These individuals were trained to have prophetic dreams about potential dangers during sea travel, including storms, enemy raids, and navigational hazards. Viking sagas contain numerous accounts of voyages being canceled or rerouted based on prophetic dreams, and many of these decisions apparently saved lives and ships that would otherwise have been lost. What's particularly interesting about Viking dream practices is that they seem to understand the difference between anxiety dreams and genuine prophetic visions. They developed specific criteria for evaluating which dreams should be taken seriously as warnings versus which ones were just normal expressions of fear about dangerous journeys. The dreams that were considered prophetic were typically highly detailed, consistent across multiple nights, and included specific information that the dreamer couldn't have known through normal means. In ancient China, the imperial government actually maintained official departments for analyzing prophetic dreams related to travel and military campaigns. These weren't just fortune tellers or court entertainers. They were highly trained individuals who studied patterns in prophetic dreams and developed systematic approaches to using dream information for practical decision-making. Chinese dream analysis was remarkably sophisticated, incorporating not just the content of dreams, but also the dreamer's health, emotional state, recent experiences, and even astrological factors. They believed that prophetic dreams were most accurate when the dreamer was in optimal physical and mental condition, and they developed specific diets, meditation practices, and sleeping arrangements designed to enhance prophetic dreaming abilities. The Chinese also kept detailed records of prophetic dreams and their outcomes, creating databases that modern researchers find remarkably useful for understanding patterns in precognitive experiences. These records show that prophetic dreams about travel disasters tend to be more frequent and more accurate during periods of political instability, natural disasters, and social upheaval, as if collective stress somehow enhances individual psychic sensitivity. Medieval European cultures had a more ambivalent relationship with prophetic dreams, often viewing them as either divine messages or demonic temptations, depending on the religious and political context. But even during periods when prophetic dreams were officially discouraged by the church, practical people continued to pay attention to vivid travel-related nightmares, especially when their livelihoods depended on dangerous journeys. Medieval merchants and traders developed informal networks for sharing information about prophetic dreams related to specific routes, ships, or travel companions. If multiple people reported similar nightmares about a particular voyage or caravan, word would spread through the merchant community, and many traders would quietly make alternative arrangements. Now, here's where things get really interesting from a modern scientific perspective. Recent neuroscience research has begun to provide some possible explanations for these historical practices that don't require us to believe in supernatural phenomena. Recent studies have documented statistical evidence that some individuals can indeed dream about future events with accuracy rates significantly higher than chance would predict. These experiments involve having participants record their dreams in detailed journals, then comparing these reports to subsequent events to look for correlations that can't be explained by coincidence or logical deduction. Studies consistently find that certain people produce dream reports that match future events with precision rates of 60 to 70%, compared to the 20 to 30% that would be expected from random guessing. What's particularly relevant to our travel stories is the finding that prophetic dreams seem to work best for emotionally significant events. People are much more likely to dream accurately about disasters, deaths, major life changes, and other emotionally charged situations than about mundane daily occurrences. This suggests that prophetic dreaming might be related to the emotional impact of future events rather than just their chronological proximity. There's also fascinating research being conducted on what neuroscientists call displacement activity in the brain during REM sleep. Groundbreaking studies have found that during sleep, some neurons not only replay recent experiences, but also anticipate future events. This research on brain activity revealed that neurons stabilize spatial representations and actually prepare for future tasks while we sleep. Some researchers have published studies suggesting that the brain's normal temporal processing gets scrambled during certain phases of dreaming, potentially allowing consciousness to access memories from different time periods, including memories that haven't happened yet. This theory suggests that what we call prophetic dreams might actually be the result of the brain temporarily malfunctioning in a way that's accidentally useful. Instead of normal memory processing, which organizes experiences chronologically, the dreaming brain might sometimes access information from a non-linear temporal perspective, glimpsing future events as if they were memories from the past. Other researchers are exploring the possibility that prophetic dreams represent incredibly sophisticated pattern recognition rather than genuine precognition. The unconscious mind might be constantly processing subtle environmental cues, changes in mechanical sounds, variations in weather patterns, alterations in people's behavior, and calculating probable future scenarios based on this information. From this perspective, the people in our stories weren't really seeing the future. They were unconsciously detecting early warning signs of disasters that their conscious minds weren't aware of. Their brains were running complex predictive models during sleep, analyzing thousands of subtle variables to identify probable catastrophic outcomes. This theory helps explain why prophetic dreams are often most accurate about disasters involving mechanical failures, structural collapses, and other events that develop gradually from detectable causes. A ship's engine might produce slightly different vibrations weeks before it fails completely, or a bridge might develop microscopic stress fractures long before it collapses, and sensitive individuals might unconsciously process these warning signs during sleep. The evolutionary perspective on this is particularly compelling. Our ancestors who could somehow sense impending dangers, whether through dreams, intuition, or unconscious pattern recognition, would have had significant survival advantages. The ability to detect subtle environmental changes that predicted disasters, predator attacks, or resource shortages would have been incredibly valuable for early humans living in dangerous natural environments. Modern research on confirmation bias and selective recall also helps explain some aspects of prophetic dreaming. We tend to remember the dreams that seem to match future events and forget the ones that don't pan out, creating an illusion that our dreams are more prophetic than they actually are. When something dramatic happens, we may also unconsciously reshape our memory of previous dreams to make them seem more accurate predictors than they originally were. But even accounting for these psychological factors, there remain cases like the ones we've discussed tonight that are difficult to explain through conventional scientific understanding. The specificity and accuracy of some prophetic dreams about travel disasters suggests that human consciousness might be capable of accessing information through channels that we don't yet fully understand. What I find most intriguing is how consistently these prophetic travel dreams seem to occur across different cultures and time periods. Whether we're talking about Polynesian navigators, Viking seafarers, medieval merchants, or modern airline pilots, the pattern is remarkably similar, vivid, specific dreams about transportation disasters that prove to be accurate warnings about future events. This consistency suggests that prophetic dreaming about travel dangers might be a fundamental capability of human consciousness, something we've evolved to do but don't fully understand how to control or interpret. Maybe our brains are constantly running background simulations of potential dangers, and sometimes these predictive models break through into our conscious awareness through dreams. The question that keeps me awake at night, ironically enough, is whether we could develop better systems for recognizing and acting on prophetic dreams. If some people really can glimpse future disasters through their sleep, shouldn't we be taking these warnings more seriously rather than dismissing them as psychological curiosities? Before we drift off for the night, let me share a few lesser-known dream stories that almost nobody talks about, the kind of forgotten warnings that slip through the cracks of history but are just as fascinating as the famous disasters we've been exploring. There's this absolutely bizarre case from 1621 involving a German clockmaker named Klaus Weber, who lived in a small village in the Black Forest. Now, Klaus was the most methodical, precise person you could imagine, the kind of man who made timepieces. So accurate that neighboring villages would set their schedules by his clocks. But starting in November 1621, Klaus began having the same recurring nightmare every single night for 3 months straight. In his dream, Klaus would find himself standing in his familiar workshop, surrounded by the gentle ticking and chiming of his beloved clocks. Everything looked exactly as it did in real life. The same wooden workbenches covered with tiny gears and springs, the same tools hanging in perfect order on the walls, the same warm light filtering through the windows that overlook the valley below. But then, always at exactly 3:17 a.m. according to every clock in the workshop, something impossible would happen. Every single timepiece would suddenly stop working simultaneously. The gentle symphony of ticking that had provided the soundtrack to Klaus's entire life would cease instantly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like death itself. What made Klaus's dream particularly unsettling was the voice he would hear in that moment of absolute silence. a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, saying simply, "Time's up, Klaus. Time's up for everyone." He would wake up in a cold sweat, absolutely convinced that he had just received a warning about his own death. Klaus was so disturbed by these recurring dreams that he documented them in his journal every day, noting any variations or new details with the same precision he brought to his clockmaking. He wrote down everything: the temperature of the air in the dream, the position of his hands when the clock stopped, the exact tone and pitch of the mysterious voice, even the way the light looked when it fell across his workbench. The dreams were so consistent and so detailed that Klaus began making preparations that seemed rational to him but appeared strange to his family and friends. He wrote detailed letters to his wife and children, explaining his love for them and his gratitude for the life they had shared together. He organized his financial affairs with unusual thoroughness, making sure that every debt was paid and every important document was properly filed. On March 15, 1622, exactly at 3:17 a.m., Klaus Weber died peacefully in his sleep. When his family found him the next morning, every clock in his workshop had stopped at exactly that time, something that was mechanically impossible since they were all wound and functioning perfectly when he went to bed. The clockmaker's prophetic dreams had predicted not just his own death, but the exact moment when his life's work would cease along with his life. Then there's the story of Maria Santos, a fisherman's daughter who lived in a tiny coastal village in Portugal in the 1890s. Maria had never traveled more than 10 miles from her birthplace, but she had the most extraordinary gift for painting disasters that would occur in distant places, based entirely on dreams she claimed came to her during the new moon of each month. Maria would wake up from these dreams with an overwhelming compulsion to paint exactly what she had seen. She would stumble from her bed to her easel, sometimes still wearing her nightgown, and begin painting with an intensity and skill that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her normal artistic abilities. She would work for hours without stopping, as if channeling visions from some other realm directly onto her canvas. Between 1893 and 1897, Maria created 43 disaster paintings based on her dreams. Her small house became crowded with these dark canvases, stacked against the walls like windows into possible futures. Local people found the paintings disturbing and morbid, wondering why someone would choose to spend their time creating such grim art when they lived in such a beautiful place. But as the years passed, something extraordinary began to happen. The disasters that Maria had painted started coming true with remarkable accuracy. A bridge in northern Spain collapsed during a flood, exactly as she had depicted it 2 years earlier. A passenger ship sank off the coast of Morocco in a storm that matched her painting down to the specific way the waves crashed over the vessel's deck. Buildings in various European cities burned in fires that followed the exact patterns she had shown in her art. 17 of Maria's disaster paintings came true with such precision that local newspapers began writing about the prophetic artist who seemed to paint the future before it happened. Reporters would come to her village to interview Maria and photograph her paintings, trying to understand how an untrained artist in a remote coastal town could predict specific disasters in distant places with documentary accuracy. The most haunting painting in Maria's collection was her last one, a scene of her own village being destroyed by flooding. She painted specific houses underwater, including her own small cottage where she had spent her entire life. She showed the local church with water up to its bell tower. The fishing boats swept inland and smashed against buildings, and specific people from her village fleeing to higher ground with expressions of terror and disbelief. 3 months after Maria completed her final painting, an unexpected dam failure in the mountains above their village caused massive flooding that destroyed most of the town exactly as she had depicted. The disaster played out like a live-action version of her painting. The same buildings were submerged. The same escape routes proved safe, and even specific details like which trees would be uprooted and where debris would accumulate matched her artistic vision with impossible precision. However, because Maria had warned the villagers and some had taken her advice seriously, most people were prepared and evacuated to safety before the worst flooding occurred. Lives were saved because an artist had dreamed about tomorrow and painted what she saw. and because some people had learned to trust in the possibility that art could sometimes serve as prophecy. Speaking of prophetic dreams that saved lives through the most unlikely circumstances, there's the remarkable case of a young telegraph operator named Timothy O'Malley who worked the night shift at a remote railway station in County Cork, Ireland in 1903. Timothy had been having the same disturbing dream for 2 weeks straight. He would see a passenger train approaching his station at full speed in the middle of the night, but the engineer would be slumped over the controls, unconscious or dead. In his dream, Timothy could see that the train's brakes weren't working, and the locomotive would crash through the station platform and derail in a catastrophic accident that would kill dozens of passengers. What made Timothy's dream particularly specific was his ability to see the exact time when this disaster would occur, 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night, when the late express from Dublin was scheduled to pass through his station without stopping. Timothy had worked this shift for 3 years and knew the train schedule perfectly, but he'd never had anxiety dreams about railway accidents before. The night his dream was supposed to come true, Timothy made a decision that violated every railway regulation he'd ever learned. At 2:45 a.m., he sent an unauthorized emergency stop signal to the approaching Dublin Express, using his telegraph key to transmit a warning about track obstruction ahead. The train's engineer, following safety protocols, brought the locomotive to a complete stop just outside Timothy's station. When the engineer climbed down to investigate the supposed track obstruction, he discovered there was no obstacle, but he also realized that he had been feeling increasingly dizzy and disoriented for the past hour. A medical examination later revealed that he was suffering from carbon monoxide, poisoning caused by a cracked pipe in the locomotive's cab. Within another few minutes, he would have lost consciousness completely, and the train would have continued at full speed with no one controlling it. Timothy's unauthorized stop signal saved not just the engineer's life, but potentially dozens of passengers who would have been injured or killed if the train had derailed while traveling at high speed. His prophetic dream had given him the courage to break railway regulations and trust his instincts over official procedures. The railway company initially planned to discipline Timothy for sending an unauthorized emergency signal, but when they discovered that his actions had prevented a major disaster, they promoted him to station master instead. Timothy said later that he never had another prophetic dream about railway accidents, as if his unconscious mind had completed whatever task it needed to accomplish. Here's one more story that'll make you question everything you think, about the relationship between dreams and reality. In 1908, a traveling photographer named Jonathan Hayes was making his way through the small towns of Montana, taking family portraits and documenting the changing frontier landscape for posterity. Jonathan had been having increasingly vivid dreams about a specific location he'd never visited, a narrow mountain, valley with a distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant. In his dreams, he would see this valley filled with people running in panic, while the ground shook violently and massive boulders rolled down, the mountainsides like giant marbles. The dreams were so persistent and so detailed that Jonathan began sketching what he saw, creating a detailed map of the valley's geography and the exact locations where the landslides would occur. He could see specific buildings being crushed, particular escape routes that would remain safe, and even individual families who would survive by following certain paths to higher ground. For months, Jonathan carried these sketches with him as he traveled through Montana, asking local people if they recognized the landscape he had drawn. Most people had never seen anything like it, but finally, in a small town near Glacier National Park, an old prospector looked at Jonathan's drawings and said, "That's Bear Creek Valley, about 20 miles north of here. But there ain't nothing there except a few mining claims and some summer cabins." Jonathan felt compelled to visit Bear Creek Valley, even though it meant a difficult journey through rough mountain terrain. When he finally reached the location, he was amazed to discover that his dream landscape was completely accurate. The sleeping giant rock formation, the cabin locations, even the specific trees and boulders were exactly as he had envisioned them. Jonathan spent several days in the valley, photographing the landscape and talking to the few residents about their lives in this remote location. He mentioned his dreams about landslides to several people, but most dismissed his concerns as the worries of a city man who didn't understand mountain geology. 2 months later, a massive earthquake triggered landslides throughout Bear Creek Valley, exactly as Jonathan had dreamed. The specific locations where he had predicted the most dangerous rock slides proved accurate, and the escape routes he had identified in his dreams were indeed the safest paths to higher ground. Several families survived because they remembered the strange photographer's warnings and followed his advice when the earth began to shake. Jonathan's photographs of Bear Creek Valley before the disaster became historically significant documents, showing a landscape that was completely transformed by the landslides. His prophetic dreams had not only warned him about a future catastrophe, but had motivated him to create a permanent record of a place that would soon be changed forever. What I find most fascinating about these lesser-known stories is how they demonstrate that prophetic dreams aren't limited to famous disasters or well-documented historical events. Sometimes our sleeping minds give us glimpses of smaller tragedies, more personal warnings, or opportunities to help people in ways that never make it into the history books. These forgotten dreamers, the clockmaker, the artist, the telegraph operator, the photographer, all experience the same fundamental phenomenon that we've been exploring tonight: the mysterious ability of human consciousness to access information about future events through dreams. Whether we're talking about the Titanic disaster or a small railway accident in rural Ireland, the mechanism seems to be the same. Our sleeping minds somehow detect patterns and possibilities that our waking awareness can't perceive. Sometimes I wonder how many other prophetic dreamers there have been throughout history, people whose warnings went unheeded or whose stories were never recorded. How many disasters might have been prevented? How many lives might have been saved if we had better systems for recognizing and acting on the information that comes to us through dreams? If you're somehow still awake, which honestly would surprise me at this point, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Leave a comment below and maybe share if you've ever had a travel dream that felt too real to ignore, or if you've ever changed your plans because something just didn't feel right. The stories we've explored tonight remind us that sometimes our deepest wisdom comes not from logic or planning, but from those mysterious messages that arrive while we sleep. Whether you believe in prophetic dreams or think they're just our brains processing patterns we can't consciously detect, the important thing is learning to listen to those inner voices that try to keep us safe. These travelers who avoided death through dream warnings teach us something profound about trust. Trusting our instincts even when they seem irrational, trusting our dreams even when they contradict our plans, and trusting that sometimes the universe might be trying to tell us something through channels we don't fully understand. Dreams don't just happen to you, they happen through you. And maybe, just maybe, they're one of the ways we stay connected to information and insights that our waking minds are too busy or too skeptical to recognize. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy falling asleep to these strange stories from history. We'll be back next week with another journey through the mysterious intersection of dreams and reality. Sleep tight, and who knows, maybe you'll dream about something we talked about tonight. Just remember to pay attention if that dream feels a little too real, a little too specific, or a little too important to ignore. See you in your dreams.